If it feels like life is over, is it worth fighting? If you've been dealt a mortal wound and then buried alive, what do you do? Give up or fight until your last breath? By surrendering, the criminal remains the victor, but as long as you're breathing, the game isn't over. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. In Phoenix City, Alabama, in a small ranch-style brick house on Maple Drive, lived a man named Forrest Boyer, known as Butch. He lived with his 12-year-old son, Brett. Butch grew up in Lee County, Alabama, in a very close-knit family. So, when his son Brett was born, it was the happiest day of the man's life. He adored his little boy, and people said Butch was a wonderful father. In reality, things weren't so rosy, because Boyer was a single father, the only person doing everything possible to provide his son with the best life he could. Butch owned a junkyard and dealt in used car sales. He worked tirelessly to be able to give Brett everything a child could dream of. The Boyers had their own brick house with a pool in the backyard. The father went to great lengths to send his son to a private school. At the time, Brett was 12 years old, in 6th grade, and was a typical boy, restless, full of life, and dreaming of the future. Brett had just entered his teenage years and was starting to show interest in girls. A few days before the events, in honor of Valentine's Day, the boy went to a dance where he danced with his little girlfriend for the first time. Sunday, February 17, 2002, was a perfectly ordinary day, and father and son spent it together. That evening, Brett was getting ready to take a shower before going to bed. His father, Butch, had already laid out the clothes the boy would wear to school the next day. The man himself was sitting at the table, going through work documents. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. It was already 10 o'clock at night, so it was unlikely that a friend had dropped by. Butch wasn't expecting anyone at that hour, which made it all very strange. When the man opened the door, he saw a stranger on the porch who introduced himself as a police officer, specifically from the narcotics division. The officer told Butch that they had a warrant for his arrest. The officer entered the house, handcuffed the homeowner, and informed him that he was under arrest for the distribution and possession of illegal substances. At that moment, Brett came out of his room because of the noise and asked his father what was happening. Naturally, the boy was terrified seeing his dad in handcuffs. Butch tried to calm his son, assuring him that everything would be okay, that it was surely a mistake, and that he wasn't guilty of what they were accusing him of. Then the man looked at the officer and asked what would happen to his son, who would look after him if he was arrested and sent to jail. Butch explained to the law enforcement officer that he was the sole caretaker of his son and that leaving a 12-year-old child alone at home was unsafe. That's when the officer did something no one expected. He put handcuffs on the schoolboy as if he posed some kind of threat. Then he led Brett and Butch out of the house and put them both in the back seat of a car waiting nearby. It was a white Ford Crown Victoria, a typical police car driven by another officer. So, Butch and his son had been riding in the car for some time, and with each passing minute, the situation began to feel more and more alarming because they drove past the police station. When Butch asked what was going on, one of the officers explained that they had to meet someone along the way. This was highly suspicious, as Butch had no addictions and certainly didn't deal in illegal substances, being a law-abiding citizen. But then the situation became even more bizarre when the two officers ordered Butch to empty his wallet and hand over all his money. After that, the men continued driving and eventually traveled 36 kilometers south of the city to a place called Seal, Alabama, turning onto an abandoned road where a new Highway 431 was under construction. There were 4 lanes of dirt road. Since it was nighttime, all construction work had been halted, and there wasn't a single source of light on the street except for the moon. When the car stopped, the officers began questioning Butch about a safe that supposedly contained a significant amount of money, over $100,000. Apparently, these men believed they'd have to extract the money from him by force, which is why they brought him and his son to this remote area. Butch calmly explained that he didn't have such large sums, but he would gladly give them what he had set aside for emergencies, provided they left him and his son alone. Seeing that the man wasn't resisting, the driver turned the car around and headed back toward the Boyers' house. There, Butch led the strange pair to his safe and pulled out a box with money. It contained about $47,000, and they took nearly all of it. The strangers also took a gun that was stored in the safe. It was a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber. Despite the fact that $47,000 was a huge amount of money, the officers were convinced that wasn't all. They began pressuring Butch, demanding the rest of the money, and it turned out they were right because Boyer eventually pulled out another stack of cash containing $20,000. However, even after this, the nighttime visitors didn't calm down. They forcibly pushed Brett and Butch back into the back seat of the car and drove them to a dark, secluded spot at the construction site. That's when Butch truly began to worry. He had given them everything he had. The man had hoped that this would keep him and his son safe, but it didn't happen. He simply couldn't understand what else they could want from them. Butch turned to his captors and said that he had nothing left, so it would be better to just let them go home. It was pointless to hold people who had given up all their savings. At that moment, the two men silently pulled Brett and Butch out of the car, and only then did it dawn on Boyer that they were going to eliminate them as unnecessary witnesses, and he began to lose his composure. Butch, realizing what the kidnappers had planned, began begging them to spare his son's life, as the boy was only 12 years old and had his whole life ahead of him. Butch didn't care about his own fate. He was terrified for his son. He even offered to take out a bank loan if they needed more money. One of the criminals grabbed Butch, threw him to the ground, pinned him down, pulled out a knife, and slit his throat from ear to ear, forcing him to shut up and avoid further trouble. At that moment, 12-year-old Brett had a breakdown. His father was his only close family. Now Butch lay on the ground, bleeding out, and his son couldn't help him in any way. The boy rushed at the kidnappers, and now it was he who began begging them to spare his dad's life, to which one of the men said that he should be more worried about himself than his father. While one held Brett, the other officer grabbed a shovel from the trunk and began digging a hole. Apparently, it was a grave meant for father and son. Despite the horrific wound on his neck, Butch remained conscious. This clearly wasn't part of the criminal's plan, so they stabbed him again. Miraculously, the attacker missed every major blood vessel, causing Butch to suffer unbearable pain. Though the man was in a life-threatening condition, he was still alive. Boyer knew he was about to die, but he fought with all his strength to stay conscious, hoping to save his son. Though, lying on the ground with his throat slit, there was little he could do. The officers brought Brett to the hole and began demanding to know where the safe was. The schoolboy had no idea what other safe they were talking about. Due to his age, he wasn't involved in his father's affairs and didn't know where he kept money. Brett broke down in tears, unable to cope with the fear. All this time, Butch couldn't see but could hear the two men interrogating Brett about a non-existent safe. The worst part was that, due to his severe injury, he couldn't even argue with them to protect his son. Then one of the officers said he had already done his part by stabbing Butch, so the other would have to deal with the kid. Without hesitation, the second man pulled out a gun, put it to Brett's head, and pulled the trigger. A shot rang out, and the teenager's body slid straight into the freshly dug grave. The schoolboy, like his father, didn't die instantly and began making incomprehensible sounds. The man leaned over the hole and shot the boy in the head 2 more times. Brett went silent. After that, the criminals approached Butch, who was still alive but pretending to be dead. They grabbed him by his arms and legs and threw him into the hole, right on top of his dead son's body. Then they tossed in the gun they had used. It was the same Smith & Wesson .38 caliber they had taken from the home safe. The officers kept joking as they shoveled dirt and mud into the hole. Butch heard everything they were saying. He lay in the grave on his 12-year-old son's body, with no idea what to do. Butch didn't know if Brett was dead or just injured. The father hadn't seen that the boy had been shot in the head and didn't even know how much longer he himself would remain conscious. All he knew in those moments was that he and Brett were being buried alive. Paralyzed by fear, Butch couldn't move, only feeling the clumps of dirt falling on him from above. The two men who committed the crime filled the grave and were certain no one would ever find out. It was a construction site that was soon to be paved and turned into a 4-lane road. Butch Boyer knew he had to do everything possible to save himself and his son. As soon as the officers' voices faded, he began slowly moving his legs, pushing his body toward the surface. The man used all his strength and will to dig himself out from under the dirt. Since the criminals were certain both victims were dead, they didn't bother digging a deep grave, merely covering the hole with a 40-centimeter layer of dirt. This saved Butch's life. After some time, Boyer saw moonlight. He kept digging with his feet and hands until he felt the fresh night air. Then he felt his son's legs and pulled the boy out of the hole. Unable to see the full horror, Butch tried to revive him. The father refused to believe he had lost Brett until the very last moment. Unfortunately, all his efforts were in vain. The teenager was dead. In that moment, the man realized he had to act before his strength completely left him. He had already lost so much blood that every minute of delay could cost him his life. He would simply die, and no one would ever know what really happened. Butch's heart was breaking. He knew he couldn't leave Brett alone. His fatherly instincts wouldn't allow it. But carrying the child in his arms to the road to seek help wasn't feasible either. So, the father made the most heart-wrenching decision of his life, to leave his son by the hole and walk through the woods to the road to flag down a passing car. When the 911 call came in, police arrived at the scene immediately. The first officer who saw Butch realized the man's life was hanging by a thread. The officer reported that the cut on the victim's throat was so severe that his Adam's apple and veins were visible, and the skin exposing his throat was hanging down to his chest. Butch's entire clothing was covered in dirt and blood. In a panic, he tried to explain to the officer what had happened, that his throat had been slit, his son had been shot 3 times, and they had both been buried in a grave. The officer called for backup and an ambulance. Within minutes, paramedics tried to load Butch into the ambulance, but he refused to leave until they found his son. Only after the officers located Brett did the man agree to go to the hospital. Even though the teenager showed no signs of life, doctors tried everything possible to bring him back, but no miracle occurred. 12-year-old Brett Boyer died from his injuries. Butch Boyer's wound also posed a serious threat to his life. Fortunately, the man's willpower and desire to seek justice for his son helped him survive and tell the police what happened. The victim was able to describe the 2 men who, posing as law enforcement officers, broke into his home, took all his savings, and then eliminated the witnesses. Butch also provided detectives with a description of the car used to abduct him and Brett, and even named one of the criminals, Jimmy Brooks. The perpetrators who attacked the Boyer family were after money. They had keys to his house and his address, so they could return at any moment to steal more. This is exactly what Butch told the investigators. The police set up surveillance on the Boyer family's home, and soon a white car, perfectly matching the one described by the victim, pulled up to the house. When authorities stopped the vehicle, it wasn't Jimmy Brooks behind the wheel. It was an unknown man in his 40s. But they knew Jimmy Brooks was only one of the 2 attackers responsible for what happened to Butch and Brett. So they detained the stranger just in case and confiscated the car. The driver had $20,000 in cash, keys to Butch's house, and blood on his clothes. And that wasn't all. When the car was searched, they found handcuffs, a sheath, shackles, walkie-talkies, and a narcotics division officer's cap. The detained man was 43-year-old Michael Carruth. Michael was a local resident of Lee County, married but with no children. He worked as a bounty hunter for a company dealing with bail bonds. He literally tracked down debtors. Michael was obsessed with money. Money was the central focus of his life, but the company itself belonged to his wife. It was through this job that Carruth met Jimmy Brooks. For a time, the men even lived together when Brooks, who had been living with his wife and mother-in-law, was kicked out of the house. 6 months before this crime, Michael had bailed his friend out of jail. Jimmy made a living breaking into cars and stealing whatever he could. He wasn't a very good thief, so he got caught, and he didn't have money for bail. His family turned their backs on him, but Michael Carruth came to his aid and posted a $35,000 bail. So, the two men were connected not only by friendship, but also by financial ties. Jimmy Brooks was preparing to sign a plea deal for a previous crime he had committed. At the time, he was out on bail, but during that time, it seems he managed to commit another crime, far more brutal than just breaking into a car and stealing. After speaking with Michael Carruth, authorities arrested 22-year-old Jimmy Brooks, charging him with the attack on Butch and Brett Boyer. It seemed he wouldn't be able to wriggle out of it, as one of the crime's victims was still alive. Butch identified Jimmy and Michael as the men who took his son's life and tried to kill him. Within 12 hours of the attack, both men were detained, and large sums of money were found on them. Police also found a pile of trash in Brooks's house. Apparently, Jimmy had tried to burn his clothes, which were stained with his victim's blood. Now both men were arrested and brought in for questioning. The two handled police pressure very differently. Michael Carruth was as calm as a snake, denying any involvement in the crime. Jimmy Brooks, unlike his friend, cracked under pressure. He immediately admitted to things the detectives had already confirmed and then told the following story. It all started when Michael posted bail for Jimmy. Brooks and his family had no money, so he was in debt to his friend. When he was released, he tried to reform and do some good deeds. He got a job at a construction site and tried to become a law-abiding citizen, but he didn't earn enough to support himself, his family, and pay back Michael. When Michael Carruth came for the money Jimmy owed him, there was none. They began discussing other ways Brooks could repay the debt. That's when Butch's name came up. Jimmy said Butch had a safe with about $100,000 in cash. Once, Jimmy had been to Boyer's house when he was working with his father. Butch and Brooks Sr. had a business relationship. One sold used cars, and the other worked in repossession. Repossession is a financial transaction where one party transfers an asset to another party with interest for a set period, then buys it back. Jimmy Sr. had been to Butch's house multiple times on business, and on one of those occasions, he brought his son, Jimmy Jr. During the visit, the men discussed a large deal. This meant Butch kept a significant amount of cash at home. Brooks Jr. overheard their conversation, and the idea to rob Boyer came to him. Michael Carruth and Jimmy Brooks Jr. compiled a list of people who kept large sums of money at home. Jimmy learned about this from his father's conversations, and Michael was a bounty hunter. Money was his element, his passion, his motivation. Carruth had a specific dream. He wanted to start a wheat farming business. He needed funds to finance this project. He knew how to handle money, but he had little of his own, though Michael knew how to get it. In short, Jimmy told Michael he was certain Butch Boyer had a lot of money, and Michael, who also knew Butch indirectly, thought stealing from him was a great idea. By the way, Butch recognized both men during the incident, but pretended he was seeing them for the first time to ensure his and his son's safety. So it's unclear what the criminals were counting on when they broke into the home of someone they knew. Jimmy said Brett wasn't part of the plan initially. They had no intention of kidnapping a child, or especially taking his life. The criminals hoped that by 10 p.m. the schoolboy would be asleep and wouldn't see anything. Waking up in the morning, the boy would surely notice his father's absence, but, to the police's dismay, wouldn't be able to provide any explanations. But when they got there, everything changed. Brett heard the noise and came out of his room, sealing his own death sentence. Jimmy Brooks Jr. was a complete coward. After telling the police about their plans, he suddenly changed his story, claiming he always believed Brett and Butch would survive. The suspect's new statement was outright drenched in lies, as just minutes earlier, he had admitted to detectives that killing Boyer Sr. was their original plan. Now, learning that Butch had survived, Jimmy feared for his life. He was certain the father would seek revenge for his son, hiring some inmate in prison to settle the score for Brett. After all, it was Jimmy Brooks who shot the teenager 3 times. While questioning Jimmy, the police also learned that 12-year-old Brett Boyer wasn't his only victim. While out on bail, the man committed another crime. In a nearby small town lived a married couple, 68-year-old Thurman Ratliff and his 62-year-old wife, Catherine Ratliff. Jimmy Jr. worked for their son and accidentally learned that the couple kept a large sum of money at home. On January 30th, 2002, a woman named Katrina got up early and, as usual, took her kids to school. By 8 in the morning, Katrina would get to work and call her mother first thing. They spoke every day at the same time. When her daughter asked what she was doing, Catherine always gave the same answer: drinking a cup of coffee. It was a familiar daily ritual. That morning, Katrina called her mom but got no answer. This was strange because her mother always waited for her daughter's call. Katrina left her mom a voicemail saying she was worried and asking her to call back. But she never heard back from her mom. Katrina kept calling the familiar number all morning, trying to reach her parents, but no one picked up. During her lunch break, the woman realized something terrible had happened, and she needed to go figure it out. She approached her boss and asked for time off. Her parents' house was just a 10-minute drive from her workplace. Katrina got in her car and spent the entire drive thinking about what could have happened. She couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. When Katrina pulled up to her parents' house, she saw both of their cars parked in the driveway. Clearly, her mom and dad were home, so she didn't understand why they were ignoring her calls. The woman tried the front door handle, but it was locked. Then Katrina walked around the house and discovered that the back door had been broken in. The anxious daughter looked inside and saw her father lying on the floor. His clothes were stained with blood. Katrina called out to her dad, but the man didn't even move. She rushed through the house looking for her mom and found her in the bedroom on the floor next to the bed. At that moment, she didn't even call out to Catherine, as she could tell from her appearance that her mother had also passed away. Barely managing her emotions, Katrina first rushed to the home phone to call the police. She picked up the receiver and discovered there was no dial tone because the phone lines had been cut. In a panic, the woman ran down the road to the nearest neighbor's house, asked him to call emergency services, and then passed out. 62-year-old Catherine Ratliff had worked as a restaurant manager for many years and also had a cosmetology license. Lately, she had been doing hairstyles for elderly women. 68-year-old Thurman Ratliff was said to be one of the hardest working people around. He was an independent tool dealer with a set route, visiting various auto shops and dealerships. The couple had raised their children and were recently enjoying a well-deserved retirement. The police who arrived at the scene concluded that the couple had been shot. Many knew they kept their savings at home. It was the money that became the motive for the murder. Inside, the police clearly saw that the house had been ransacked. The attic ladder had been torn from its hinges, cabinets had been moved, drawers pulled out and thrown on the floor. Ventilation grills, the heater, and the air conditioner had been removed from the walls. Clearly, the criminals were looking for cash, but after tearing the house apart, the robbers overlooked a metal canister in the bathroom containing $87,000. The police began investigating and determined that the Ratliffs had no obvious enemies. Everyone they spoke to had positive things to say about Catherine and Thurman, and no one could recall a single person who might have deliberately harmed the couple. Investigators checked recently released criminals and people the couple had hired for home repairs. However, the only person they seriously considered who might have had a grudge against the Ratliffs was their daughter Katrina's ex-husband, Norman. Norman had repeatedly threatened Katrina's entire family, particularly Thurman and Catherine. According to other relatives, this man was capable of violence, especially since, after the divorce, he became extremely cruel toward his ex-wife. Once, Norman ambushed his wife near her workplace. When she, unsuspecting, got into her car, the man caught her off guard. He climbed into the car, threatening her with a knife, and ordered her to drive to a secluded spot. Katrina realized her ex-husband was drunk, so she was afraid to confront him. In the end, he pulled her out of the car, tied her up, gagged her, beat her, and then assaulted her. The woman's ordeal lasted for several hours. Then, as if something snapped in Norman, he told Katrina to just get up and leave. The woman ran to her car, got behind the wheel, and drove straight to the police station. Norman was on the run for 2 weeks before he was arrested and charged with kidnapping and assaulting his ex-wife. Norman took a plea deal, admitting guilt to kidnapping. For that, he received a sentence, and the other charges were dropped. Now, with the deaths of Thurman and Catherine Ratliff, the police turned their attention back to Katrina's ex-husband as someone prone to violence. However, the investigation showed he was 160 kilometers away from the crime scene, in prison. The detectives had no other leads. The case stalled until Jimmy Brooks Jr. confessed that Michael Carruth had dropped him and another man, 27-year-old James Gary, off at the Ratliff's house. Michael gave them instructions on how to deal with the homeowners, where to look for the money, and how to avoid leaving DNA evidence at the scene. The criminals took weapons, put on masks, and broke into the couple's home. Thurman and Catherine were watching TV when the perpetrators broke down the back door, cut the phone lines, grabbed the retirees, threw them to the floor, and began demanding money. The homeowner said the money was hidden in the back of the house, after which he was shot. At that moment, Catherine panicked, ran, and tried to lock herself in her bedroom, but was also shot multiple times. When it was over, the criminals found a small amount of cash, then contacted Michael via walkie-talkie and asked him to pick them up. The stolen money was split 3 ways. They didn't think to check the metal canister in the bathroom where the rest of the Ratliff savings were kept. By that time, James Gary had already been arrested on charges of possessing illegal substances. The police questioned him in prison, and he confirmed Jimmy's version of events. Jimmy himself claimed that, at the time, neither he nor James had any other choice. He couldn't refuse, as both he and James owed Michael money for the bail he had posted. Michael, when questioned, denied everything, even when both Jimmy and James admitted their involvement in the crime and pointed to him as the organizer. He still refused to admit his guilt. Michael offered to take a polygraph test, was willing to wear a wire to help the police, and demanded to be placed in a witness protection program. Despite the investigators' persistence, Carruth never confessed to physically harming Butch or killing Brett. He claimed he was there, but didn't get out of the car and didn't hurt anyone, though the blood on his clothes suggested otherwise. The one thing Michael didn't yet know was that Boyer had survived. When Carruth was told this, all the color drained from his face, because it was he who had slit Butch's throat. In the end, all 3 men were charged with the deaths of the Ratliffs, and Michael and Jimmy were additionally charged with the attack on the Boyer father and son. The trials of the criminals took place 2 years later. Butch had to come to terms with the fact that his son was gone forever. During the court proceedings, the father had to relive the nightmare of that night. Boyer believed God had spared his life so he could tell the story and seek justice for Brett. The judge could barely hold back tears as he listened to the account of how Michael and Jimmy laughed and joked while burying Butch and his underage son. It was so emotionally heavy that after Boyer's testimony, the judge called for a recess. Meanwhile, the defendants showed no remorse for their actions. As a result, 45-year-old Michael Carruth, a man with no significant criminal history, was sentenced to death for the murder of Brett Boyer and the attempted murder of his father, Butch. 24-year-old Jimmy Brooks Jr. faced the same fate. People capable of harming anyone from a child to an elderly person don't deserve to live on this earth. For the case of Catherine and Thurman Ratliff, Both received additional life sentences. The third accomplice in the crime against the couple, James Gary, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the school where Brett Boyer studied, a memorial plaque was installed with the inscription, "The light of his face will always shine upon ours. His spirit will always live with us." At the 6th grade graduation ceremony, an empty chair with a gown and a rose stood on the stage for Brett. Many classmates said that he physically left the class but remained with them spiritually. Additionally, 12 trees were planted in front of the school, one for each year of Brett Boyer's life, a boy whose life was cut short far too soon. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. Toys are not always dolls or cars. Toys come in different forms, and people can treat them differently too. For example, the kind-hearted Andrew Gardner was turned into a toy of the House of Horrors by the people living under the same roof. Andrew was a very vulnerable, shy, and quiet man. He wouldn't even hurt a fly. Because of his traits, he always wanted to please others. Despite some challenges in his life, everything was going well until he met a woman who completely changed his fate. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Claire Nichols was born in 1981 in Portsmouth, a city on the southern coast of the United Kingdom. Little is known about her family, but something bad likely happened to her as a child, causing serious trauma. Considering the horrific things Claire did as an adult, it's unlikely a happy person would wake up one day and decide to do what Claire Nichols did. At an early age, doctors noted she was slightly developmentally delayed. When Claire was 15, she left her family home. Her parents were going through a divorce at the time, with constant arguments between them. Claire left because of the divorce, and it wasn't an organized move. She didn't go to a foster family or live with relatives. The teenager simply packed her things and left the home where she spent her childhood. The 15-year-old schoolgirl was left to fend for herself, so she soon met a man named Malcolm and moved in with him. They lived together for 2 years, until Claire turned 17. After breaking up with Malcolm, she continued to drift around, scraping by with odd jobs. By 18, Claire was tired of her nomadic life and realized she wanted some stability. Around this time, she met a man named John Peterson. John Peterson was also from Portsmouth. He had once served as a radar operator in the Royal Navy. But John Peterson was 46 years old, while Claire was only 18. Although she was technically an adult, she was still a child compared to John. The age difference wasn't the only red flag, as John Peterson had previously been convicted of a crime against a minor. He didn't hide his dark past. Despite this, over the next few years, they had 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son. It might seem like the young girl fell into a trap with an older man and became his victim. But in reality, it was the other way around, as Claire was cruel to John. According to Peterson, Claire was obsessed with control. She would lose her temper over the smallest things, was prone to verbal and physical abuse, and constantly manipulated him. Later, John called her a devil and the most evil person on earth. While living with Claire, he had to report his every move to her. The young woman kept everything under control. If he did something she deemed out of line or annoying, he faced physical abuse. For example, if he went to the corner store for groceries without her permission, Claire would go berserk, attacking him with her fists, throwing objects, and calling him the worst names. This happened constantly. Every day they lived together. And then, in 2003, John couldn't take it anymore. He was less worried about himself than about the children. Although Claire's aggressive behavior had never extended to the kids, he knew she would eventually cross that line. It got to the point where Peterson called social services, saying he feared for his children's safety because their mother's behavior was too abusive and manipulative. But the authorities ignored John's complaints, citing his prior conviction for crimes against minors. No one took his words seriously. Worse still, social services called Claire and threatened to take her children away unless she ended her relationship with the convicted man. After that call, Claire packed her things and left John, taking the kids with her. She was 21 at the time. She decided to move closer to her mother and sister, who were living in Newcastle in northeast England. There, Claire entered a new relationship with a man named Stephen Martin. Stephen was 37, 16 years older than his partner. Once again, the age gap wasn't the only red flag. Stephen Martin had previously lived with Claire's mother for several years. It wasn't just a fling or a casual relationship. It was a serious, long-term commitment. With her new partner, Claire continued to act like a tyrant, using intimacy as a tool for control. Since Stephen's intelligence was below average, he was the perfect victim for a woman like Claire. Their relationship was highly unstable. It would start and stop, lasting only about 2 years until Stephen disappeared from the picture. But Claire found a new victim. It was 31-year-old Andrew Gardner. They met at a course for people with special needs. Andrew Gardner grew up in Hetton-le-Hole in northeast England with his parents Ken and Jean and 2 brothers. As a child, Andrew was a caring, loving boy who enjoyed goofing around with his brothers, going fishing with his father, and spending all his free time with his close-knit family. When Andrew started school, he struggled with learning. Because of this, he was transferred to a specialized school, which he successfully completed. Later, he found work as a car park attendant. Due to his extreme vulnerability and very low IQ, he was easily manipulated and used by others. He was exactly the type of man Claire liked. When Andrew was 31, he met Claire Nichols. Previously, he had dated Claire's sister, so the young woman who had been in a relationship with her mother's ex-boyfriend now began one with her sister's ex. It was some strange pattern. Andrew Gardner fit right into the family and took on the role of father to his new partner's 3 children. He got along wonderfully with them, and everyone considered him a genuinely good father who took the kids to the park, walked them to and from school. Claire also appeared to be a caring mother, and people saw them as almost an ideal family. But, as practice shows, perfect families don't exist, and soon, behind closed doors, everything began to fall apart. As mentioned earlier, Claire was obsessed with control. In Andrew, she saw a person who was supposed to follow her orders, serve her, and do absolutely everything for her. Claire herself showed no love, care, or affection toward Andrew. Like most tyrants, she came up with weak excuses for her behavior, calling Andrew a lazy and useless man, labeling him worthless. She would lash out at her husband if he didn't do household chores to her standards, didn't bring in enough money, or tried to stand up to her. Their family life turned into a barrage of insults constantly raining down on poor Andrew's head. At first, he suffered only verbal abuse meant to humiliate, completely destroy his self-esteem, and shatter his confidence. But it wasn't long before the verbal abuse escalated into physical violence. Claire regularly beat Andrew for the slightest violation of her rules and began limiting the amount of food he could eat. When she cooked dinner, she and her 3 children sat at the dining table, while Andrew was forced to sit on the floor and wait for scraps. Often, instead of dinner, he received only insults and accusations of being useless. Claire called her husband a burden on the family budget and encouraged her children to yell at Andrew, which they did, mimicking their mother, as they thought it was normal behavior. Andrew was literally starving. He lost a lot of weight and began secretly stealing food from the cabinets, sneaking unattended pieces of bread or chocolate. When Claire found out, she cut out all the pockets from Andrew's pants so he couldn't steal and hide food. Additionally, she started counting the cookies and candies in the cupboard and weighing the leftover food in the fridge. Most likely, she took pleasure in Andrew's suffering, as she didn't just starve him, but also began depriving him of sleep. When he dozed off, Claire would wake him and force him to walk around the room. Then she decided to do what all abusers do, completely isolate Andrew from his friends and family. She took his phone and forbade him from contacting relatives. Andrew wasn't allowed to leave the house except to take the children to school down the street and pick them up at the end of the day to bring them home. Andrew Gardner was an incredibly vulnerable person, easily manipulated because he simply didn't know how to say no. With her skillful manipulation, Claire made Andrew completely cut ties with his family, and he didn't speak to them for over a year. But in 2006, about a year after their relationship began, Andrew broke her rules and went to visit his family. He did it in a way that Claire had no idea about his escapade. When he showed up at his parents' house, everyone was shocked because they hadn't heard from him in months. During their last conversation, Andrew had said he wanted nothing to do with his family, and now, standing before them was not the sweet, quiet guy, but his shadow. He looked pale, frail, and sick, with tears in his eyes. When Andrew took off his shoes, his mother noticed inflamed blisters on his feet. He explained to his family that he had washed his feet and decided to dry them by a fire but fell asleep, resulting in a burn. When his parents looked at Andrew, they immediately told him he needed to leave that woman. They promised to do everything possible to help him escape the relationship, but Andrew refused, not wanting to drag his family into trouble. The only thing he asked for was some money and food, after which he left almost immediately. He was afraid Claire would find out he had disobeyed her. Soon after that visit, Andrew called his grandmother and left a voicemail, asking her to thank his mom and dad and tell them he probably wouldn't be able to visit again. Sadly, his words proved prophetic. Andrew's parents would never see their son alive again. That unexpected visit in 2006 would be the last. For weeks and months afterward, his mother repeatedly tried to contact him but couldn't find him. Andrew's family thought he was still living in Newcastle, but in reality, he, Claire, and the children had moved to Chilton, County Durham. Fast forward a few years to 2008. Andrew Gardner had been living with Claire for 3 years, and with each passing day, the torture and suffering only worsened. The family with 3 children, though it could hardly be called a family, moved to house number 14 on Arthur Street in the small town of Chilton, about a half-hour drive south of Newcastle, where they had lived before. Later, this house would be known as Claire Nichols' House of Horrors. After the move, Andrew Gardner's life became even worse because, in addition to Claire, others joined in tormenting him. One was 22-year-old Simon Nichols, Claire's younger brother. Simon, like most people around him, was terrified of his sister and always did whatever she asked. The second person who also moved into the new house was Claire's former partner and her mother's ex-boyfriend, Stephen Martin. The 2 housemates became Claire's accomplices and began abusing Andrew alongside her. At the same time, another significant event occurred. Claire gave birth to a child with Andrew, a girl whom Gardner adored. After 3 years of torment, he had lost all interest in his own life, and the child became the reason he kept going. So, in 2008, 8 people lived in the House of Horrors. Claire, the mastermind and main instigator of all conflicts. Andrew, the primary victim of the abuse. Claire's brother Simon, and her former boyfriend Stephen, who obeyed Nichols, and 4 children. The 3 older children were aged 6 to 9, while Andrew's daughter was only a few months old. When Simon and Stephen moved in, the violence and torture reached a new level. Stephen Martin didn't move into Claire's house by chance. A physical relationship reignited between them. Now they weren't just sleeping together but doing so in front of Andrew. Claire did this deliberately, saying she got more aroused seeing another person's pain and humiliation. She loved having power and control over everyone in the house. But Gardner's suffering excited her the most. She forced him to watch while she was intimate with another man. But she got even more aroused when inflicting physical pain on Andrew. It got to the point where Claire and Stephen would first beat, kick, and scratch Gardner, then immediately engage in sexual activity. With each instance, Claire became more aroused, and eventually her torture reached an utterly inhumane level. Claire constantly came up with new punishments for Andrew. She brought her wild, perverse fantasies to life with the help of her 2 accomplices, Simon and Stephen. Both men were eager to please their so-called mistress. Andrew was whipped, lashed with long pieces of curtain wire across his bare body. The thin wire left huge, ragged wounds on his skin. Then, the tormentors took a wet kitchen towel, tied in a knot on one end, and struck Andrew's exhausted body multiple times. The wet towel was heavy and left massive bruises. Then the abusers moved to burning, holding a lighter to Gardner's skin, or turning a heater to full power and pressing his hands against the heating elements. Once, Claire, Simon, and Stephen forced Andrew to stand in an empty bathtub, boiled a kettle, and poured scalding water on his feet. The pain was so excruciating that he couldn't stand, let alone walk, for a long time. Claire also took immense pleasure in branding Andrew's skin. The inhabitants of the House of Horrors would find any metal objects, keys, nails, or ordinary forks. They heated them and scratched his skin with the hot metal. Once, they decided to play tic-tac-toe on Gardner's back. One of the men took a sharp object and drew a grid for the game, after which the other two took turns carving X's and O's in the squares. It was inhumane, but it greatly amused Claire, Simon, and Stephen. Andrew's wounds bled profusely, but no one treated or tried to relieve them. To prevent him from staining the sofa or carpet with blood, Claire spread newspapers on the floor and forced him to lie there. Claire's priority was maintaining order in the house. She wanted to control everything and everyone, including her own children. It started with her ordering her 3 older children to monitor Andrew's every move. They had to report everything he did to her, watch him in the kitchen to ensure he didn't steal food, and prevent him from going outside. Claire also ordered her children to physically abuse Andrew. She encouraged their verbal insults and made them call him worthless and useless. The children would gather around Andrew lying on the floor, kicking, hitting, and jumping on him like a trampoline. He would curl into a fetal position and not even try to resist or defend himself, because he knew it was their mother, making the children cruel. For a while, early on, Andrew had been a father figure to the kids. He loved them in his own way and tried to be there for them. The most horrific part of this story is that Claire had so thoroughly brainwashed them that they believed Andrew truly deserved such treatment. This caused psychological harm to the children themselves. Why did an adult man endure all this abuse? Why didn't he just stand up and walk out the front door? There were several reasons. First, let's not forget that Gardner was incredibly vulnerable from childhood and easily manipulated. Second, Andrew now had a young daughter with Claire. The girl lived with them in the house, and he simply couldn't bring himself to leave her behind. Though he had a low level of intelligence, he knew he could never escape with his daughter without Claire finding out. So the abuse continued until March 2009. By then, Andrew's body was completely exhausted. He suffered from constant hunger and weighed only 57 kilograms at an average height of 175 centimeters. For an adult man, this was a severe weight deficit. On top of that, he was beaten and injured daily. Gardner's body was covered in numerous cuts, bruises, and burn marks. In total, he had over 100 injuries of varying severity. To top it all off, due to prolonged starvation, Andrew suffered from blood poisoning and lung disease. It's believed he physically wouldn't have been able to escape the house even if he wanted to. He simply didn't have the strength to flee. Yet even then, Andrew still clung to life. His little daughter gave him strength. She was his entire world, and he lived for her, holding on to hope deep in his soul that one day there would be a way out, that his tormentors would lose interest in him, and then everything would be okay. But, sadly, that never happened. On March 13th, 2009, Claire decided to deliver another brutal blow. Her motive was the same as always, that Andrew was a lazy, useless, worthless person. She called him the worst names and screamed that she cursed the day they met. After verbal insults, she took off all her rings before hitting Andrew several times. Stephen and Simon were also in the room when Claire started throwing punches, and soon the men joined in the beating. Andrew curled into a fetal position on the floor, trying to protect his head and chest. He desperately hoped and prayed the attack would stop, but his tormentors took turns kicking and stomping on him. Then Claire slammed Andrew's head against the floor several times, stood on his back, and began jumping, using all her strength and weight. At that moment, he was barely showing signs of life. By the end of the attack, Andrew had broken ribs that had actually pierced his lungs. He also suffered a brain hemorrhage, but he was still alive, still clinging to life in some astonishing way. To finish Gardner off, Claire and Stephen made love next to him, after which everyone went about their business, leaving the injured man alone. A few hours later, during which Andrew endured unimaginable, excruciating pain, he passed away. Later, the autopsy would show he was conscious, but unable to move due to the pain. Essentially, he suffocated because his broken ribs had pierced his lungs. After the brutal attack, realizing they had gone too far, Claire, Simon, and Stephen panicked. Although they had done everything to ensure Andrew died in agony, they now didn't know what to do with the body or how to avoid punishment for their crime. In the end, the inhabitants of the House of Horrors came up with a plan. They were likely confident in their impunity. That same evening, when Gardner died at 11:27 p.m., Claire called emergency services, pretending to be deeply concerned about her partner's condition. According to her, Andrew was on his way home when he was attacked by unknown assailants. The attackers robbed and beat him so badly that he barely made it home. When paramedics arrived at house number 14 on Arthur Street, they could only confirm the death of 35-year-old Andrew Gardner, as he no longer needed medical attention. He was lying on the living room floor in just his shorts. He wasn't breathing, had no pulse, and his body was rigid. Everything indicated he had been dead for several hours. The story about the attack seemed suspicious to the paramedics, so one of them asked Claire when Andrew had returned home and how long he had been lying on the floor in that condition. Nichols replied that it had happened about half an hour ago. He had told her how strangers attacked, robbed, and beat him. After that, Andrew collapsed on the living room floor, unable to stand, and began struggling to breathe. Claire called emergency services, but apparently it was too late. Simon Nichols told police that Gardner left the house around 8:30 p.m. and only returned after 11 p.m., complaining of being attacked. Claire Nichols said she was upstairs when her partner came home, while Stephen Martin and Simon were watching TV. The doctor examining Gardner's body immediately realized the woman was lying, as Andrew had been dead for several hours based on his condition. And judging by everything, his death was slow and extremely painful. The paramedics immediately called the police. The body was taken for an autopsy, and Claire, Simon, and Stephen were taken to the police station for questioning. The three criminals tried to stick to their story that Andrew had been robbed, but their words sounded unconvincing. Investigators didn't believe their story, and the autopsy results confirmed that things were not at all as the trio tried to portray. Andrew Gardner's body was so battered that it took 6 medical experts, including burn specialists and emergency trauma surgeons, several days to complete the examination. The first thing the pathologist and colleagues noticed was severe emaciation, followed by numerous signs of abuse, including the tic-tac-toe game carved into the victim's back. The autopsy revealed about 150 injuries of varying severity, including 21 broken ribs, burns on his feet, neck, and back, whip marks, severe bruising, a skull fracture, and brain injuries typically seen in car accidents or falls from a height. Detectives also used luminol during the inspection of Claire Nichols' house to find hidden traces and bloodstains. It turned out blood was almost everywhere, though someone had tried very hard to clean it up. This only confirmed that Andrew Gardner was not a victim of random criminals. He had been tortured and then killed by the people living under the same roof: Claire Nichols, her brother Simon Nichols, and her partner Stephen Martin. As mentioned earlier, Andrew's mother had tried for a long time to contact her son, but couldn't find him. His parents didn't even know he had moved to another town with Claire or that they had a granddaughter. When Jean and Ken Gardner heard on the local news on March 14, 2009, that a 35-year-old man had been brutally killed in a house in Chilton, they didn't think much of it. It never crossed their minds that their son would meet such an end. Detectives broke the horrific news to the parents the next day. The extent of Andrew's suffering from his injuries became fully clear when the case finally went to trial. Pathologists and expert witnesses went into agonizing detail about how Gardner sustained all his injuries. As the police admitted, this case was particularly difficult for them due to the extreme level of violence. It was probably one of the most brutal cases they had ever investigated. What shocked the detectives most was that the main orchestrator of the abuse against her partner was a young mother of 4. Claire, Stephen, and Simon initially claimed their innocence. They kept trying to avoid punishment, but when they realized no one believed them, they turned on each other, trying to pin the blame for the abuse on anyone but themselves. At one point, the trial had to be paused because when Simon Nichols was on the stand giving testimony, he said Claire had delivered the final blow that killed Andrew. Claire, who was in the courtroom at the time, heard her brother's accusation, jumped up, and tried to attack him. She was so enraged that she couldn't contain her anger and aggression, even in front of the jury and the public. Court bailiffs had to restrain her, and the hearing was briefly adjourned. Throughout the trial, none of the defendants showed any remorse. But the jury in the Crown Court wept when they watched a video of Claire's 7-year-old son describing how they abused his stepfather. He said, "My mom caught and pushed him because he stole a chocolate bar. She did it because Andrew often stole food. We beat him too. I scratched him with keys and hit him with my fist, and we also wrote a curse word on his back. We did it with a pen and nail polish." The boy thought Andrew Gardner had been sent to prison because he nearly destroyed their family. The child didn't even know Andrew Gardner had died. Hearing such things from a 7-year-old was deeply disturbing, and it was even more unsettling to realize that the children weren't just witnesses to the horrors in their home, but active participants in the abuse. By the end of the trial, the jury had no doubt that all 3 defendants were guilty. By the way, one of Claire Nichols' former lovers cried when she was sent to prison. The man said he could have been in Andrew Gardner's place, and the thought gave him chills. He still had nightmares after years of living with Claire. "She beat me all those years we were together, 4 or 5 times a week," Nichols' former boyfriend recalled. For the brutal murder of Andrew Gardner, 28-year-old Claire Nichols was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 32 years. Her brother, 24-year-old Simon Nichols, was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 25 years. Claire's 44-year-old partner, Stephen Martin, was also sentenced to life with a minimum term of 20 years. They can only apply for parole after serving their minimum terms behind bars. All 3 tried to appeal the length of their minimum sentences, which their lawyer called clearly excessive. However, the judges of the London Court of Appeal rejected the appeal, stating that the harsh sentences previously imposed were fully justified by the horrific crimes committed by the defendants. Andrew Gardner was described as a caring, loving, and friendly person who trusted people and was ready to do anything to help a loved one. Due to his character traits, he was incredibly vulnerable, which the criminals exploited. But even in the hardest times, Andrew remained kind to his partner's 3 children, despite their behavior. And for his little daughter, he was willing to endure abuse and deprivation. He just wanted to be near his child and watch her grow. Sadly, all of that was taken from him when he was only 35. The most horrific part of this story is that 4 children suffered. First, they were forced to grow up in an unhealthy environment where their mother encouraged their abuse of their stepfather. And now 3 of them are left without parents altogether. At the time of the trial, the eldest was 10 years old. They knew they had a father, John Peterson, but by the time this happened, Peterson was also behind bars. He had been convicted of molesting a 5-year-old girl, so Claire's children were clearly unlucky with both parents. Claire and Andrew's youngest daughter, because of what her mother did, had to spend some time growing up in prison. But more importantly, she now has to grow up without her loving father, whose life was taken by her own mother. 16 years after the murder, all 3, Claire, Stephen, and Simon, are still in prison, where they belong. In prison, Claire Nichols befriended Rose West, who ran a cross-stitch club. Rosemary Pauline West is a British serial killer who, along with her husband Fred West, tortured and killed at least 9 young women and her 8-year-old stepdaughter. Rose was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The friendship between these two criminals, Claire Nichols and Rose West, raises serious concerns. Apparently, the two murderers and sadists had plenty to talk about. In the end, the authorities never got answers to the question of why Claire, Simon, and Stephen committed the crime. What drove them at the moment they slowly took the life of the person living beside them. Regarding Claire, it was known that she took pleasure in controlling, manipulating, and abusing others. But what made Stephen, who had once been in Andrew's and Simon's position, and Simon, who feared his sister, participate in the torture? Why didn't they report her to the police? Could this woman have intimidated them so much that they committed a crime for her sake? If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. The proposal of marriage, how sweet. Excitement, nervousness, love. Will you be my wife? The guy got down on one knee and looked at the girl with hope. She agreed with delight. This scene would have been perfect if, just an hour earlier, these two hadn't committed a bloody massacre. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Isabella Gosling was born in 1995. She grew up in Bournemouth, United Kingdom, a coastal resort town where the events of this case unfolded. Little is known about Isabella's childhood. She herself claimed that her mother was very cruel, but these statements were not backed by facts. At the age of 7, Isabella was diagnosed with a personality disorder and autism. Autism spectrum disorder manifests differently in everyone, varying in severity, symptoms, and when they appear. Autism is a disorder resulting from impaired brain development, characterized by a pronounced and comprehensive deficit in social interaction and communication, as well as restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. The main symptoms of autism spectrum disorder are difficulties with social interaction, meaning these individuals struggle to communicate with others, perceive the world in their own way, and their behavior is atypical for most people. Sometimes they seem emotionally detached, uninterested in what's happening around them, as if living in their own imaginary world. As for Isabella, she had significant difficulties with socialization, finding it very hard to make friends, which left her feeling incredibly isolated and lonely in everyday life. This led to Isabella growing up very angry. She was resentful and lashed out at those around her, often pushing people away before they could hurt her. As a teenager, Isabella became a cruel manipulator, only interacting with peers when she could use them for her own gain. She didn't care about other people's problems or feelings, never genuinely cared about anyone but herself, and felt no guilt or remorse for her behavior. Isabella lied to everyone around her and went through life leaving chaos in her wake, though she didn't care about that either. In March 2014, at the age of 19, Isabella met a 21-year-old young man named Philip Nicholson, and from that moment, everything in his life went downhill. Philip also lived in Bournemouth. He was described as the kindest, most sincere person you could ever meet. He always cared more about other people's interests than his own. But there was one other thing that set Philip apart. As a child, he was diagnosed with developmental delay. This meant a slower pace in the development of emotional and volitional processes and some cognitive functions, such as speech, memory, and thinking. Essentially, it meant that a child needed much more time to reach certain milestones compared to other children of the same age. Philip often struggled to understand the world around him. Because of this, he could easily become despondent, or, conversely, overly excited. However, despite these challenges, he had a very happy childhood. Philip's best friend was his grandfather, who always took the boy on small trips, wanting to introduce his grandson to the world. Philip was also incredibly close to his parents. He grew up very trusting and loyal, saw only the good in others, and was willing to do anything for his family. But this sincerity and vulnerability made it very hard for Philip to distinguish a genuinely good person from someone pretending to be kind. Because of this trait, malicious people like Isabella Gosling could easily exploit him for their own purposes. Philip was just over 20 when he told his mother he wanted more independence. At the time, the young man still lived with his parents, but felt it was time to become independent and move out on his own. For a family aware of his challenges, letting him go into adulthood was very difficult. Nevertheless, they respected their son's wishes and tried to meet all his needs. Deep down, his parents couldn't imagine how he would manage living alone, whether he could handle the challenges or avoid trouble. At the same time, they understood that sooner or later, they would have to accept that he was an adult. Philip wanted to grow as a person and felt he couldn't do that while his mom and dad were taking care of him. Soon, the young man moved out of his parents' home into an apartment in Bournemouth. He wasn't yet able to fully manage his life because his condition required regular visits from social workers. Most of the time, Philip was left to himself, but social service workers regularly checked on him to ensure he paid his bills on time, maintained proper hygiene, knew how to cook, and was generally safe. This went on for several months. Philip kept repeating that he wanted to live completely independently, that the constant oversight from strangers was starting to annoy him, and eventually it was decided that he was fully ready for independent living. Philip's dream came true. Now, more than anything, the young man wanted to find a girlfriend and enter his first romantic relationship. His parents strongly supported him in this desire. Having grown up in a very close-knit, happy family, Philip dreamed of creating one just like it. He idolized his father and mother and wanted the same kind of relationship in the future. Initially, his family was somewhat cautious about this. They knew their son was very sensitive and worried about how he would handle potential rejection on a date. At the same time, Philip was very easy to manipulate, so his parents tried to teach him how to respond appropriately in different situations, make safe decisions, and what to pay attention to when interacting with others. Philip even had to pass a test to ensure he was capable of starting romantic relationships on his own, and he passed it with flying colors. So the young man was fully ready to start dating a girl and build his personal life. After downloading a dating app, Philip began looking for a potential partner and soon met Isabella Gosling, the villain of this case. And it was this meeting that became fatal for the special young man. At their very first date, 19-year-old Isabella and 21-year-old Philip hit it off. They were both, in a way, isolated from society. Both felt rejected in childhood, and this brought them closer. Isabella said it was hard for her to interact with strangers, and only with Philip did she feel safe. The young man was over the moon with happiness. For the first time in his life, everything was falling into place as he wanted. Philip was living separately from his parents, and now he had a girlfriend who understood him. He wanted to spend every free minute with Isabella, to care for her and be the best boyfriend for his beloved. Deep down, the young man already envisioned them building a happy family and having children, but it was nothing more than empty dreams. Philip genuinely had the purest intentions toward the girl. The same couldn't be said for Isabella. Her plans for Philip, unfortunately, were quite different. They were far more sinister and repulsive. It turned out that Isabella wasn't looking for love or a serious relationship at all. She needed someone she could use for her own purposes, and Philip was perfect for that role. From the very first date, the girl started asking Philip for money. At first, Isabella borrowed money, with no intention of ever paying it back. Then she began demanding that he pay for various nice things for her. Due to his childlike naivety and trust, Philip didn't see anything wrong with this. After all, Isabella was now his girlfriend. He was used to seeing only the good in people, so he didn't notice any red flags and genuinely didn't realize he was being used for someone else's benefit. Very soon, Isabella and Philip's relationship moved to a physical level. The girl started demanding intimacy several times a day. Because Philip had no experience with women, he felt very uncomfortable. He didn't fully understand the concept of consent or boundaries, but Isabella knew this well, and taking advantage of the young man's inexperience, forced him into intimate acts that were unpleasant for him. This was nothing short of sexual abuse. The constant stress began to affect the young man's mental health. He experienced severe anxiety, was always on edge because Isabella constantly pressured him into bed, and he didn't know what she would ask of him next. On top of that, Isabella was mean and aggressive. She constantly yelled at her boyfriend and verbally insulted him. Philip started to fear his girlfriend and tiptoed around the house just to avoid triggering her anger. Meanwhile, Isabella lived for her own pleasure, doing whatever she pleased. Due to his developmental issues and lack of experience in communication and romantic relationships, Philip thought this was normal, that this was how it should be, that such treatment in a relationship was acceptable. He believed Isabella was his girlfriend and wouldn't deliberately torment or hurt him. This went on for a long time until Isabella got bored. One day, the girl grew tired of it and started an affair with another man, 25-year-old Richard Moore. Richard was a male version of Isabella. He was just as cunning, brazen, and malicious a manipulator, felt no empathy, and preferred to use people for his own gain. This was likely what brought them together. Richard had a troubled past. He was homeless and lived on the streets for some time. Additionally, he had legal issues related to violence. Surviving among other outcasts, he often harmed those more vulnerable. He might steal things or food, hit or beat someone. He was arrested but soon released. No one wanted to deal with the problems of the homeless. Isabella introduced Richard to her boyfriend, and now the couple's strange relationship turned into a tangled love triangle. It's unclear whether Nicholson realized what connected his girlfriend to this man, but they started spending a lot of time together as a trio. Due to his condition, Philip saw nothing wrong with this. He considered the man a new friend, though Richard posed a serious danger to vulnerable people like him. And Isabella simply twisted the situation to her advantage. The more time the young people spent together, the more Richard grew jealous of Isabella's relationship with Philip. However, the girl constantly reassured him that she was only using Nicholson for money and had no feelings for him. Moreover, Isabella convinced Richard that they could both spend the money of the clueless Philip, which they did. To make it easier to access the money, Isabella insisted that she and Philip open a joint bank account, since they were in an intimate relationship, which was almost like being husband and wife. The unsuspecting Philip was only happy that he was gradually building his own family and did everything the girl asked of him. But Isabella and Richard thought this wasn't enough. They took out several loans in Philip's name, leaving him drowning in debt. Soon, Nicholson's family found out what was happening and tried to warn their son. They did everything to convince him that Isabella wasn't right for him, that her intentions weren't good, and that she was manipulating him. Philip trusted his family, so he decided to end the relationship. He told Isabella that he didn't like how she treated him and that he no longer wanted to be with her. However, Isabella Gosling, being a manipulator, didn't accept his decision. She outright told him that he couldn't leave her because they had an intimate connection. The girl managed to convince her boyfriend that it was unfair and wrong of him to take advantage of her innocence and then break off the relationship. And now Philip felt trapped. He was the kind of person who cared more about others' comfort than his own inconvenience. He told his parents that Isabella was his girlfriend, and he wanted to take care of her and remain faithful to her. The young man saw how his father had been loyal and devoted to his mother all these years and wanted to behave the same way. From that moment, Philip's emotional and physical condition continued to deteriorate. The stress from his relationship with Isabella took a toll on his body. Philip was constantly sick and losing weight. He stopped eating properly, neglected personal hygiene, and stopped shaving. His hair and beard were a mess. He didn't keep his apartment clean. Everything around became dirty and unfit for normal living. Eventually, Philip's parents decided enough was enough and that something had to be done. They saw that Philip was physically unwell, wasting away before their eyes. So his mother and father held a family meeting and involved social workers. Together, they spoke to Philip again and tried to explain the true state of affairs. It was at that moment that the young man realized not everyone in the world was good. It seemed his parents finally got through to him. He saw clearly and understood that Isabella really wasn't right for him. At that moment, Philip was determined to break up with her. He told the girl that it was over between them and that they were no longer a couple. Of course, Isabella wasn't about to let go of her living ATM, as she called her boyfriend, behind his back. She used a weapon against which Philip had no defense. The girl told him she was pregnant with his child, so they had to stay together. Philip was stunned. He had always dreamed of becoming a father. He had a very close relationship with his parents and wanted to be just as close to his own child. Upon learning that Isabella was pregnant, he couldn't leave her. They had to try to become a model family for their future baby, and so Isabella got what she wanted. Philip was once again trapped in this relationship. This went on for a few more months. While the young man eagerly prepared to become a father and awaited the arrival of his son or daughter, he was completely under his girlfriend's control. Philip wanted to be the best partner for Isabella and was ready to pamper her, just to ensure the pregnancy went smoothly. However, it was all just another manipulation by Isabella. In reality, there was no child. The pregnancy was a fabrication, a way to keep the guy who was willing to spend money on her by her side. Isabella made up this story to trap Philip, knowing it was the only thing that could make him change his mind and stay with her. However, Isabella wasn't just lying to Philip. She was deceiving Richard too, who believed the child was his. He also had no idea that Isabella had fabricated the pregnancy. In essence, she lied to both men, making each believe he was the father of the unborn child. And all this was just to have complete control over both Richard Moore and Philip Nicholson. In the spring of 2015, Isabella took her manipulations to a whole new level. She decided to pit the two men against each other and began instigating constant arguments between them. The girl deliberately flirted with both of them in front of each other, sparking jealousy. And Philip and Richard argued over who loved Isabella more. But in reality, she didn't need either of them. Later, the girl came up with another outrageous story. She told Richard that Philip had assaulted her when she was 4 months pregnant. This was yet another lie from Isabella, because Philip would never have done such a thing. He was too devoted to the mother of his child. However, according to Isabella, Richard had to defend her honor. And he fell for this trick like a fish on a hook, wanting to take revenge for the fabricated assault. At first, he sent Philip threatening text messages, saying he would kill Nicholson if he didn't stay away from Isabella, and then he moved to action. On May 4, 2015, Philip went on a family vacation. Together with his family, the young man went on an excursion to the Harry Potter studios in London. And this day was supposed to be a happy one, because the whole family could gather together for the first time in a long while. But during the trip, Philip's phone started receiving one threatening text after another from Richard, and the young man didn't let go of his phone all day. He was constantly texting, always distracted. Philip's parents noticed he was spending too much time on his phone, as if he didn't enjoy spending time with them. Their son grew more and more irritated with each passing hour. His father directly asked him what was wrong and who he was texting with all the time. However, Philip acted as if nothing serious was happening. He just brushed it off with jokes. His parents knew something was wrong but didn't want to interfere. They wanted to give their son personal space because that was what Philip wanted most of all. He wanted independence. In the end, he was an adult, so his parents backed off and stopped asking questions. But in reality, Philip was being harassed and attacked by Richard all day long. Richard sent one text message after another, some of them vile. The rival wrote that Philip would dig his own grave and repeatedly said he would send Nicholson to the other side. These threats continued for more than one day. One day, Philip was walking down the street and saw Richard turn the corner. This wasn't a mere coincidence. Richard was waiting for him, and wanted to attack him right on the street. Fortunately, Philip noticed the guy, turned around, and ran. He managed to jump on a bus and escape, but he was too scared to get off. As a result, the young man rode the same route for hours. Out of fear, he even wet himself. Philip needed to use the bathroom, but didn't get off the bus even after that. Eventually, he called his mom and told her what was happening. Of course, she came and took her son home, helping him clean up. Since his mom was now aware of what was going on, she tried again to convince her son that Isabella was taking advantage of his kindness, and it was time to end the relationship. Philip went to Isabella and told her he would help raise the child, but he no longer wanted to live with her. The girl refused to let him go once again. As a result, the couple found themselves in a very complicated situation. They would rekindle their romance, then break up, only to get back together again. It was an endless cycle, but Philip put up with it, believing he was doing the right thing for the sake of the future baby. Isabella didn't care about the deception. She didn't care at all about the psychological pressure and stress she was putting Philip through. Instead of support, she started sending him messages from another girl, just for fun, to torment him even more. Isabella posed as Emmy and wrote to Philip that she would love to go on a date with him. Due to his developmental delay, the young man had no idea that someone could create a fake profile. Such a thing never even crossed his mind. Despite being quite loyal to Isabella, he was already fed up with this wild story. Reading a message from another girl, he was thrilled because someone else showed romantic interest in him. Philip saw Emmy as a chance to escape the toxic relationship with Isabella. A small ray of hope sparked in his heart. Philip called the so-called Emmy, but unfortunately, it was Isabella on the other end, disguising her voice beyond recognition. After talking with Emmy, he arranged to meet her at a pub. But when Philip arrived for the date, instead of Emmy, Isabella was waiting for him with Richard. And even then, with his cognitive abilities, Philip didn't realize there was no other girl in reality. He thought his girlfriend and friends were just coincidentally at the pub. While the young man was upset that Emmy didn't show up, Isabella and Richard laughed behind his back. They found it amusing how easily they fooled naive Philip. And worse, the pair made him buy them drinks all evening. This wasn't a one-time occurrence when Emmy arranged a date but didn't show up. Instead, Isabella and Richard were always there. Every time this happened, Philip suffered more and more. He genuinely believed he was communicating with Emmy, but couldn't understand why she kept ignoring their meetings. Surprisingly, this wasn't the end of Isabella and Richard's sinister schemes, as their next plot was far more malevolent. By mid-May 2015, Isabella's supposed due date was rapidly approaching. Due to her fuller figure, she easily fooled both men with her fake pregnancy. So in mid-May 2015, Isabella invited Philip to her apartment under the pretext of a serious conversation. The young man assumed it was about their child, so he agreed to meet. He was worried that the girl might need help, as she was pregnant. Philip remained a kind person and believed in the sincerity of others. But as soon as he entered the apartment, he fell into another trap. Isabella and Richard were already waiting for him. They took Philip's phone and wallet, locked the door, cutting off his escape route. First, Isabella demanded that Philip apologize to her for the assault. The young man had no idea what she was talking about because he had never done anything wrong. Usually soft and compliant, Philip this time stood his ground and flat out refused to apologize. Isabella grew angrier, yelling and attacking her former boyfriend. Then Richard stepped in. He didn't limit himself to shouting, and soon verbal aggression turned physical. The girl didn't stay idle either. She grabbed a nearby mop and dustpan and started striking. Philip sustained serious injuries, and it soon became clear that the vicious pair had no intention of letting him go. Somehow, the young man managed to open a window in Isabella's bedroom. He climbed out to the street and ran home as fast as he could. Philip couldn't call anyone, couldn't take a bus or call a taxi because he had neither his phone nor his wallet. He had to walk home. And, fortunately, he made it to safety unharmed. His parents didn't wait for the situation to escalate further and, after talking with social workers, reported the incident to the police. For some reason, law enforcement ignored their report and didn't investigate the case. But the tormentors didn't stop there. The next time Philip saw Isabella and Richard, the outcome would be far more devastating. Early in the morning on May 26, 2015, Isabella decided to lure Philip to her apartment again. When the young man, scared after the last visit, refused, the girl used a dirty trick. She told him that Emmy, the girl who wanted to meet him, was waiting at her place. It's obvious that any reasonable person would have sensed the deception, but Philip was different from most, so he seized the chance to finally meet Emmy. They arranged with Isabella to meet at a local shopping center. Richard, of course, was there too. All three were captured by a surveillance camera in the store and on the street. Isabella convinced Philip that Emmy was waiting for him at the apartment, and he agreed to go there. Neighbors recalled seeing the young man that day. He looked very agitated, nervous, and scared. But Isabella and Richard urged him on, saying Emmy couldn't wait to meet him and told him to hurry. As soon as Philip entered the apartment, as soon as the door closed behind him, Isabella and Richard pounced on him. The girl again demanded apologies for the assault and wouldn't let him go until he said he was sorry. Philip's refusal to admit guilt gave Richard an excuse for a brutal attack. The man already had arrests for violent crimes and often got into fights, and now he had a noble goal: to protect the mother of his future child. It didn't matter whether Richard believed Philip had assaulted Isabella, he just needed a reason, so he lunged at Nicholson and started hitting him with his fists. Isabella watched and egged Richard on. She enjoyed that two guys were fighting over her, though in reality, defenseless Philip was lying on the floor while Richard stood over him, delivering blow after blow. The girl wanted to capture this moment for the rest of her life, so she pulled out her phone and started recording the fight. Isabella filmed the savage attack, and you can hear her in the background, urging Richard to hit harder. She felt no remorse, no sympathy for Philip. She didn't care that this young man had spent a year doing everything to keep her happy and satisfied. He gave her his love, attention, care, and money out of kindness. And Isabella was filming as he was brutally beaten. The video lasted over 10 minutes, during which Philip screamed in agony, but the vicious pair kept demanding apologies for the fabricated assault. And even if he had broken and apologized, it wouldn't have stopped the merciless attack. They didn't need his confession. They needed an excuse to beat a vulnerable, defenseless person. Soon, the situation escalated to the extreme. Richard ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and without hesitation began stabbing Philip's body over and over. Philip screamed in pain, but this only fueled his rival's rage. Despite the intensity of the attack, Nicholson remained conscious. At one point, he turned to Isabella and, looking at the camera with a plea, whispered that he just wanted to stay friends. Defenseless Philip, lying on the floor in a pool of blood, even in his final moments had the purest intentions. All he wanted was to be friends. All he asked was for them to stop. He had already apologized multiple times for unintentionally offending the girl and begged to be let go home, but his words went unheard. Isabella and Richard were incapable of empathy. They didn't care. When Philip fell silent, too weak to resist, Richard stood over him and continued the torment. He said no one would miss him when he was gone, that he was needed by no one. Isabella ordered her boyfriend to stab Philip one last time, which Richard, of course, did. Unfortunately, this stab wound was fatal. At that moment, Philip Nicholson's heart stopped. After committing the horrific massacre, Isabella continued recording the video. You could hear her and Richard casually discussing what to do with Philip's body. The lovers came up with a brilliant plan: to stage a voluntary departure from life. They wanted to make it look like Philip had taken his own life, clearly thinking they could get away with it. What Richard and Isabella did next was simply foolish. They placed the murder weapon, the bloodied knife, in the kitchen sink, far from Philip's body. Even if one assumed he had inflicted the wounds on himself, The knife would have been near the body, not in the sink. Then Isabella and Richard simply left the apartment without trying to clean up. Their DNA and fingerprints were everywhere, including on the murder weapon. And this was one of the worst attempts to cover up such a heinous crime. The pair left the crime scene holding hands and embracing each other. They hopped on a bus and headed to the city, planning to spend a pleasant day together. The crime happened early in the morning, leaving them with the whole day ahead. Upon arriving in the city, the most shocking thing happened. Just minutes after the pair took an innocent person's life, Richard got down on one knee and proposed to Isabella. Apparently, he thought this was the best time for such a momentous occasion. The girl was thrilled and immediately agreed. The rest of the day, the couple planned to celebrate their engagement. But Richard and Isabella were enjoying their happy ending, unaware that the police were already on their trail. Just minutes after the murder of Philip Nicholson, a call came into the emergency services. Most likely, it was one of the neighbors who heard the screams. When police arrived at Isabella's apartment, they broke down the door, rushed inside, and saw a horrific scene with the lifeless body of a young man. From the defensive wounds on his hands and the murder weapon lying in the kitchen sink, officers immediately concluded it was a deliberate attack. Investigators also reviewed the building's surveillance footage and saw Philip, Richard, and Isabella entering Gosling's home early that morning. But only two came back out. Richard and Isabella immediately became the prime suspects, and it didn't take the police long to track them down. The enamored couple was arrested just hours after the attack, almost immediately after their bizarre engagement. Richard Moore didn't deny his involvement in the murder, and immediately confessed to what he had done. However, Isabella Gosling had no intention of ruining her life over some guys. At first, she blamed everything on Richard, her fiancé, whom she had gotten engaged to just half an hour earlier. The girl said Philip came to visit her, that it was just a friendly visit. But Richard, out of nowhere, flew into a rage and stabbed Philip. Isabella claimed she was too scared to intervene. The police checked her phone and found a 17-minute video. The footage clearly showed that technically Richard was the one who attacked Philip with the knife and took his life. But at the same time, the 17-minute video showed the girl giving instructions from behind the camera and urging him to deliver the final blow. This video was sufficient evidence to charge Isabella Gosling. Unlike Richard, the girl didn't plead guilty, so she stood trial. At the hearings, she spouted complete nonsense, trying to somehow justify her actions. Isabella claimed she now saw ghosts and that Philip's spirit had visited her. He was supposedly upset with Richard and said Isabella was not to blame. Naturally, no one took her absurd nonsense seriously. It was during the trial that the fake pregnancy story came to light, and Richard learned he had been deceived too. Isabella Gosling was found guilty of taking Philip Nicholson's life. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. She must serve at least 19 years before being eligible for parole. Richard Moore pleaded guilty, so no trial was held in his case. The young man was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years behind bars. Philip's grieving parents criticized the inadequate care provided to their son by social workers and police. An investigation report revealed numerous shortcomings in the protection and care provided to Philip by the agencies involved. The hardest thing for the Nicholson family was realizing that their son's tragic death could have been prevented. Isabella and Richard committed a senseless crime, taking the life of a defenseless person with a kind heart and the purest intentions, who believed everyone was good and simply wanted independence. He wanted to find friends and meet a girl to be happy and start a family, and their motives remained unclear. Isabella and Richard were simply evil, heartless people who enjoyed tormenting the weak. There's no other explanation. Isabella was clearly the mastermind behind the crime. She pitted the two guys against each other, fabricating a pregnancy and accusing one of them of assault. Richard believed all these lies, thinking he was defending the honor of the mother of his child, though this is no excuse for the murder. But without Isabella's involvement, Philip would still be alive. Despite what Richard told Philip before his death, that no one would miss him when he was gone, that he was needed by no one. It's not true. This special young man, distinguished not by his intellectual level, but by his kindness and untainted soul, left too soon. He was only 22 years old. People who knew Philip remember him as the kindest, most caring and generous person. But no one wants to remember Richard and Isabella. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. This guy could have become a Hollywood star, shining on red carpets and screens in cinemas worldwide. But he chose to become famous in a different way, by becoming a killer. This is the story of Ryan Grantham, the guy who gained popularity in the show Riverdale. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Ryan Grantham appeared in about 30 different films and TV series, and is known for his roles in projects such as iZombie, Falling Skies, Jumper, Supernatural, Riverdale, and many others. However, in recent times, his name has appeared in the media not for his acting achievements at all. Ryan turned out to be a murderer who committed a horrific crime just to remain a good son in his mother's eyes. The pandemic that broke out in the spring of 2020 forced people around the world to hunker down in their homes and apartments, spending all their free time with family. Ryan and Barbara were in their townhouse, passing the evenings playing board games. The woman was even somewhat glad to spend a lot of time with her grown son. In recent years, Ryan had increasingly faced difficulties because his acting career was on the decline. He had no idea how to cope with the fact that he was no longer being offered roles, so he was angry at the whole world. The young man even moved from his student dorm into his mom's house because he desperately needed the support of a loved one. Barbara did everything she could to somehow help her son, to make him smile and forget his problems. Her son Ryan and her older daughter Lisa were the ones she lived for, the ones she woke up for every morning. Tired of board games, Ryan went up to his room on the second floor, and Barbara sat down at the piano and began to play. She knew her son loved it when she played the instrument, so she put her whole soul into performing a familiar melody. At that moment, the woman had no idea that her minutes on this earth were numbered, and she wouldn't even finish the piece for her beloved son. The reason was the illicit drugs that had already taken over the mind of the person planning to take her life. Ryan Grantham was born on November 30th, 1998. He grew up in a small town called Squamish in British Columbia, not far from Vancouver. It was here that the rest of today's story took place. Ryan spent his childhood with his mom Barbara and his older sister Lisa. His father left the family right after his son was born, and afterward, Ryan had almost no contact with his dad, which undoubtedly had a significant impact on his life. From a young age, the boy felt abandoned and unwanted, simply because his father had literally rejected him. This later led to a whole host of other problems. From his earliest years, Ryan experienced psychological difficulties, suffered from anxiety, and developed a speech impediment. And all of this was again linked to the lack of a relationship with his father. When it was time to start school, things got even worse for Ryan because his classmates bullied him mercilessly. Much of this was due to his speech impediment. Another reason the kids tormented Ryan at school was his short stature. He was the smallest student in his class. This issue followed him into adulthood. His height was only 5 feet 2 inches, 157 centimeters, and due to his slender build, he looked much younger than his age. Because of all the bullying he faced, Ryan developed severe social anxiety. He felt like an outsider, banished from society. And already at the age of 11 or 12, due to mental health issues, Ryan began contemplating suicide. The only person who helped him cope with his struggles and was always there for him was his mom. Barbara Wade was the greatest support and pillar for her son. She was described as an amazing, selfless woman with a sharp mind and incredible charisma. She had a special bond with both her children and loved spending time with them outdoors, skiing, biking, hiking, or just walking. Despite her short stature, which she later passed on to her kids, she was strong and brave, overcoming difficulties with an unwavering positive attitude. Barbara loved animals. There were always four-legged pets in the house, and she was also a wonderful caregiver for her elderly mother. Overall, Barbara was a remarkable person, a good mother, and a caring daughter. But she couldn't replace a father or friends for her son. Ryan's family was incredibly close-knit, and he had a very good relationship with his older sister, Lisa. And with friends around, he often put on performances for his loved ones. The thing is, Ryan had one very strong passion. From a young age, he dreamed of becoming an actor and starring in movies. For now, his family played the role of his enthusiastic audience. His interest in acting emerged early, when he was just 6 years old. Ryan imitated the habits of some adults so hilariously that Barbara started taking him to acting classes and then to various auditions and castings. And it paid off. At age 8, Ryan began appearing in TV commercials, which was a significant event for both him and Barbara. When he turned 9, his acting career took off even further because he landed his first role in a film called The Secret of the Nutcracker, which offered a fresh take on Hoffman's classic tale. It was a Canadian Christmas fantasy film, quite mediocre. But for Ryan, getting a movie role was still a huge achievement. It was his first major role, a springboard for the boy's future work. After The Secret of the Nutcracker, other opportunities opened up for Ryan. Over the next year, young Grantham played 8 different roles in film and television. Sure, they were just supporting characters, but for a child, his age, it was a dream come true. Then Ryan was offered a guest role in the series Supernatural. The boy played a memorable character named Todd, who had superhuman strength and used it to get revenge on his bullies. Ryan loved the role because it was exactly what he fantasized about during the times he was bullied at school. Playing Todd, Ryan was essentially playing himself in an ideal world. Landing a role in Supernatural was the ultimate dream for a kid. But after appearing in the popular series, all doors opened for Ryan. Soon, he landed a role in the major Hollywood film The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, where Grantham played one of the main characters as a child. The cast included several Hollywood stars: Johnny Depp, Colin Farrell, Heath Ledger, Jude Law, and a young Andrew Garfield. Acting alongside such outstanding masters was simply incredible. That same year, Ryan joined the cast of the Canadian fantasy miniseries Reese Kingdom Falling. By 2010, Ryan Grantham had already appeared in numerous Hollywood and Canadian projects. All of the boy's roles, with his cute appearance, were small, but he was building his portfolio while learning from the greats. For a beginner, it was a hugely successful experience, and Ryan clearly felt he was on the right path to one day becoming a global star. His mom was always by his side, inspiring him to chase his dream. Barbara did everything to get Ryan noticed. She drove her son all over Canada and the United States so he could attend castings or reach film sets. In 2010, 11-year-old Ryan landed a role in Diary of a Wimpy Kid. It was an adaptation of Jeff Kinney's popular book series about the adventures of an ordinary middle school student. After this project, the young actor earned critical acclaim, was nominated for several awards, and won Best Actor at a Vancouver short film contest. That same year, Ryan got a role in the comedy Marley and Me, The Puppy Years. It was a sequel to Marley and Me, released straight to video rather than in theaters. Still, landing a role in this film was very difficult. In 2012, when Ryan turned 13, he got the lead role in the fairly large-scale film Becoming Redwood. In the movie, 11-year-old Redwood, played by Grantham, believed he could reunite his parents by winning a golf tournament. Becoming Redwood was named the most popular Canadian film of 2012 at the Vancouver International Film Festival and received the jury's honorable award for Best Canadian Film. It was a huge milestone for the boy, as the film was set to screen in theaters. There are plenty of behind-the-scenes clips from this project where Ryan chats with the director. clearly having a blast on set. The teenager was in his element and genuinely happy during those years. The young actor's career was going great. He was gaining recognition and starting to land lead roles. All his dreams were coming true, but unfortunately, it didn't last long. After the drama, becoming Redwood, Ryan Grantham's acting career began to decline. He continued taking small roles in low-budget and mediocre films, but from that point, he appeared on screens much less often. Apparently, Ryan had reached an age where his childlike innocence faded. He became a teenager, and competition skyrocketed. It was a very tough period for Ryan, who was used to casting directors being charmed by his looks and talent. This happened to many child actors. Yesterday, they were little stars with big promise, and today, all the good roles passed them by. Ryan himself struggled to cope because he had a whole range of mental health issues. His condition improved when he focused on acting, and everything was going well. But now things were sliding downhill again, and depression and anxiety returned in a more severe form. The young man found it hard to communicate and interact with people, so he started dabbling in weed to escape. Soon it turned into a real addiction. Negative thoughts crept in, and he felt like a worthless outcast again. Suicidal thoughts returned. On top of that, the young man began struggling with intimacy, finding it very hard to figure out his sexual preferences. In 2016, Ryan turned 18, graduated high school, and enrolled at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, and it seemed like things were looking up again. Grantham was invited back to film sets, even landing a lead role in the Canadian film Considering Love and Other Magic, a teen romantic comedy where Ryan played a shy ghost, unable to leave a house for over 60 years. Grantham started appearing in guest roles in series and TV movies again, playing teenagers, and soon after, Ryan lucked into the American series Riverdale, based on the Archie comics. This role was apparently the most iconic in his career. Though it was just a small part, Ryan played a character crucial to the plot's development. Over 7 seasons, the series followed the life and adventures of the cheerful, never-down Archie Andrews and his friends in Riverdale. The story unfolded in the modern world, where the main characters explored the hidden underbelly of a small, peaceful town, its oddities and dark secrets lurking behind a festive facade. At one point, filming was briefly halted to rewrite the script due to the death of a lead actor. The first episode of Riverdale's 4th season was entirely dedicated to the character Fred Andrews, Archie's father, who died in the show. Fred was played by actor Luke Perry, who suddenly passed away during filming from a stroke at age 52. Luke Perry was a very popular actor and character in the series, loved by many Riverdale fans. An entire episode was dedicated to Fred Andrews, the character Perry played. In the show, Fred died in a car crash, and Ryan Grantham played the man responsible for the accident. It was a striking scene, lasting no more than a minute, and Ryan's character never appeared again. Despite appearing on screen only once, his character played a key role in the plot. It was after this small role in Riverdale that Grantham hoped his acting career would take off again. He went to auditions, kept chasing all kinds of roles, but was constantly rejected. In total, Grantham's filmography included about 30 projects, an impressive number considering he wasn't even 20 yet. At the time, Ryan was still in university, just trying to do something with his life and desperately holding on to a positive attitude. But he struggled to keep it together. To cope, he started using drugs again. It happened more and more often, turning back into a full-blown addiction. Ryan's mom, learning of her son's problems, did everything she could to help. Barbara always gave Ryan moral support in everything. Twice, at her urging, he checked into rehab, but each time he relapsed after leaving. Now Grantham faced even more mental health struggles. He felt incredibly isolated, and his anxiety worsened. This led him to stop talking to classmates, leave campus, and move back home to live with his mom. Then Ryan started skipping classes. His grades dropped. Studying and even basic assignments became difficult. It all ended with the threat of expulsion. Yet Ryan told his mom nothing about his university troubles because he didn't want her to be disappointed in him. He was ashamed of constantly failing. First, his acting career fell apart, and now he was flunking school. Ryan just wanted his mom to be proud of him. All this time, Grantham lacked male support since he didn't speak to his father. On top of everything, Ryan's mom, Barbara, was diagnosed with cancer and had to undergo treatment. She was incredibly strong and brave, determined to beat the illness, but her health left much to be desired. This made Ryan feel even worse and more anxious. By late 2019, 21-year-old Ryan was in his fourth year of university. At the time, he was battling severe depression, but hid it even from his mother. Barbara sensed something was wrong with her son, but didn't realize how bad it was. Ryan started thinking about ways to end his life again. Around the same time, the young man fell into the dark side of the internet, becoming obsessed with violence. Grantham watched disturbing content on the dark web, real videos of executions, assaults, torture, car crashes, anything where people died on camera. Around then, he also became interested in firearms, started visiting gun clubs in Canada, and bought 2 rifles and a shotgun. He was also drawn to serial killers and perpetrators of mass violence. Ryan saw himself in them because most were outcasts. The 2019 film Joker, starring Joaquin Phoenix, had a particular influence on Grantham. The movie was set in the early 1980s. Comedian Arthur Fleck lived with his sick mother, who taught him from childhood to always wear a smile. Trying to bring good into the world and make people happy, Arthur faced society's cruelty. Everyone saw him as different. Gradually, the protagonist concluded that the world wouldn't get his kind smile, but a villain's smirk. Ryan truly empathized with the character, who, like him, struggled with mental health issues. In the film, the Joker resolved his inner turmoil by killing the talk show host who represented evil to him during a live broadcast. Immersing himself in Arthur Fleck's world, Grantham began fantasizing that he might do something similar. He started believing that violence in some form could end his mental health struggles. Ryan planned every possible way he could take someone's life. He dove headfirst into darkness, continuing to watch real deaths on the dark web. In March 2020, the pandemic began. The whole world went into lockdown, and now Ryan faced even greater isolation than before. It became too much for him. At that moment, he decided his fantasies shouldn't stay fantasies. He wanted to make them real. Grantham's diary filled with disturbing entries about committing mass violence. The young man was heavily inspired by the Joker. He decided the world would know his name. His photo would be on newspaper covers, and everyone who ignored him before would talk about him. Lost in dark dreams, Ryan planned to kill Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He believed that would cement his name in history, even if negatively. So Ryan began plotting Trudeau's assassination, gathering weapons, learning to make Molotov cocktails, and tracking the Prime Minister's travels. But first, he decided he needed a practice run by taking a life. That person would be his own mother. It wasn't that he didn't love his mom. Ryan just didn't want Barbara to witness his fall from grace. He didn't want her to feel shame, grief, or devastation because her son had become a criminal. It was truly heartbreaking because his mom was the only person who loved Ryan despite all his flaws and was his greatest support. Barbara poured her heart and soul into raising him, and now Grantham wanted to shield her from his downfall in this horrific way. He even filmed himself walking around the house with a rifle, rehearsing how he'd shoot his own mother. These videos were later presented in court as evidence of premeditation. On the evening of March 31st, 2020, Ryan and Barbara were home alone. His older sister Lisa had moved out by then. Mother and son played board games to pass the evening. Barbara thought they were having a great time. At 6:45 p.m., Ryan suddenly stood up from the table and left the living room. He went upstairs to his bedroom to grab a .22 caliber rifle and carry out his deadly plan. Ryan started descending the stairs and, halfway down, saw his mom sit at the piano and begin playing. The young man adored when Barbara played music for him. In that moment, he froze, sat on the steps, and listened. For the next 15 minutes, Ryan sat immersed in the magical world of sound, watching his mom's hands dance across the keys. From the stairs, he could see the back of her head, but she noticed nothing around her. Barbara didn't hear Ryan stand up, aim the rifle at her head, release the safety, close his eyes, and pull the trigger. Grantham fired once, hitting his mother in the head and killing her instantly. Instantly, Barbara fell from the chair to the floor. Blood oozed from her wound. In that moment, the life of 64-year-old Barbara Wade tragically ended. Fortunately, the woman never saw that her son did it. Otherwise, it would have broken her completely. 15 minutes is a long time to weigh everything and abandon a sinister plan to kill the woman who gave you life and raised you. But Ryan thought differently. He grabbed his camera and started filming a video for his vlog. Grantham walked around the house, recording everything, including Barbara's lifeless body on the floor, and narrating what he'd just done. It only fueled his desire for infamy. He wanted to be remembered. When the recording was later shown in court, everyone heard how cold and emotionless the young actor's voice sounded as he described taking his own mother's life. Psychologists said it could indicate a loss of sanity, that physically the young man didn't realize what he'd done. But the defendant himself refuted that. The recording ended with Ryan standing in front of a mirror in his bedroom, saying in a frightened voice, "You just shot your mother in the back of the head, and you think you're so cool?" Whether it was belated regret was unclear. Then Grantham moved to the second part of his vile plan. At 7:15 p.m., the young man got in his car, drove to a nearby gas station, filled a large canister with gasoline, and returned home to make several Molotov cocktails. He spent the rest of the evening filling glass bottles with flammable liquid. Meanwhile, he smoked weed, drank beer, and watched TV, with his mother's body lying just a few feet away. The next morning, Ryan woke up and had breakfast like any ordinary day. After that, he performed a farewell ritual over his mother's body. He hung rosary beads on the piano so they dangled over Barbara, lit candles, said a few prayers, and then covered the body with a white sheet. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I hate myself," Grantham wrote in his diary that day. "The media writes a lot about me. I appeared in movies and on TV a lot, but no one will ever understand why I did it." After the farewell, Grantham went outside, loaded 2 rifles, a shotgun, the incendiary bottles, and some survival gear into his car. Ryan even made a playlist for the trip, and then set off to kill Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He also planned a deadly mass shooting afterward. So Ryan was on his way to his target. But there was one problem. Trudeau lived in Ottawa, and Grantham was near Vancouver. Getting to the Prime Minister's residence required about 50 hours on the road. Ryan embarked on an incredibly long road trip with the intent to carry out his sinister plan. But after driving east for 3 hours, covering about 125 miles to the town of Hope, he suddenly changed course, turned around, and headed back to Vancouver. Apparently, Ryan realized he wasn't all-powerful, and killing the Prime Minister would be far harder than murdering his own mother. But he wasn't giving up. A new plan was already forming in his head. Grantham considered various options. First, he wanted to drive to Vancouver's famous Lions Gate Bridge, stop the car, block traffic, start throwing Molotovs, and shoot people. Then Ryan thought about going to his university campus and carrying out a mass shooting there, spreading as much fear and panic as possible. Sitting in his car near the campus, Grantham smoked weed and visualized every detail of how he'd act. But something clicked inside him, and he abandoned the mass violence ideas, deciding to just end himself. Ryan put the pistol to his head, but soon realized he couldn't go through with it. He started the car and drove to the nearest police station to turn himself in. "I killed my mother," he told the officer at the sheriff's office desk. While Grantham confessed to police, his older sister decided to check on their mom. Lisa, worried that her calls and texts went unanswered, went to the townhouse, let herself in with her key, and walked into a horrific scene. Barbara's lifeless body lay on the floor, covered with a white sheet. Blood was everywhere. Rosary beads hung from the piano, and candle stubs still smoldered around the body. It fell to the daughter to discover her mother's body in this gruesome state. Lisa immediately called the police. Detectives arriving at the scene searched the house and found Ryan's camera with his recorded confession. After the horrific discovery in the family home, Lisa struggled with PTSD for a long time and barely coped with the devastating loss of her mother. Because of it, she even lost her job as a lawyer. Lisa couldn't believe until the end that her own brother had raised a hand against the person willing to sacrifice her life for him. What hurt Lisa most was that Ryan didn't even give their mother a chance to defend herself, attacking while her back was turned. The promising actor was arrested and charged with murdering Barbara Wade. A trial began. Ryan's defense tried to argue insanity, citing the mental health issues Grantham was experiencing at the time. His lawyer claimed Ryan committed the crime due to a mental disorder, including severe clinical depression. But after evaluation by several psychiatrists, Ryan was deemed sane. He did have disorders, but at the time of the crime, he was of sound mind and fully understood the difference between right and wrong. Accordingly, he bore full responsibility for his actions. The prosecution stated that Ryan had committed a heartbreaking abuse of trust. His mother was a wonderful person, and he had no reason to fear her. Ryan Grantham fully admitted his guilt. He explained to police that he couldn't let his mother witness the violence he planned to inflict on the world and himself. Thus, he avoided a full trial and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 14 years. This meant he could be released at age 37. The very possibility of his release caused concern, especially since he had planned a mass shooting. After all, Ryan sent his mother to her death just so she wouldn't learn of his evil plans and be disappointed in her son. When passing sentence, the court also imposed a lifetime firearms ban on Grantham. He received necessary psychological help. In prison, Ryan grappled with the consequences of his actions. He hoped to dedicate the rest of his life to making amends. "It hurts to think how wastefully I spent my life," he said at the time. "In the face of such a horrific tragedy, apologizing feels pointless. With my whole being, I ask for forgiveness." Ryan Grantham, with a breaking voice, told the court there was no excuse for killing his own mother. Ryan wasn't even surprised by the verdict. His lawyer said in an interview that Grantham expected this outcome. But the attorney worried that due to his client's short stature and slender build, prison would be very hard. There he could face physical, psychological, and sexual violence. The young actor likely wasn't thinking about that when he aimed the rifle at his mother's head. Ryan Grantham showed great promise in the film industry from early childhood. Had it not been for his drug use and refusal to grow up, he might have become one of today's greatest actors. But there's also a high chance of a different outcome. Perhaps Grantham's guest role in the hit series was the peak of his success. And now many know him only as the young man who took the life of the person closest to him. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. On August 20th, 1989, two brothers from Beverly Hills went to the movie theater. They bought tickets for Batman. Then the young men returned home and discovered that their parents had been brutally murdered in their own residence. At least that's how it appeared from the outside. This is the story of the Menendez brothers, which has captivated the minds of Americans for over 3 decades. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. This story shattered the image of the perfect American family and gave rise to one of the most controversial trials in true crime history. Who were Eric and Lyle Menendez? cold-blooded killers or two broken sons driven to the edge. Almost at midnight on August 20th, 1989, a call came into the police department in the luxurious Beverly Hills area on 911. On the other end of the line was 21-year-old Lyle Menendez. His voice was noticeably trembling. Usually 911 dispatchers in this area received calls about alarm activations or suspicious persons on the street. So the operator was caught off guard when he heard Lyle's words on the other end of the line that someone had shot his parents. After this message, the dispatcher was stunned for a couple of seconds and only, recovering from the initial shock, relayed the incident address to the patrol services. House number 722, North Elm Drive, Beverly Hills. This was not just a house, it was a huge mansion, a sign of wealth, a beautiful Spanish-style estate spanning 840 square meters, with 7 bedrooms located on a well-maintained lot surrounded by palm trees. The building's roof was covered with red tiles and evoked the charm of old Hollywood. The elaborate structure itself indicated the financial well-being of the home's owners. However, for the Menendez family, this was just a house, and now the scale of horror inside the mansion shocked even seasoned officers. The scene was very disturbing. One of the investigators later admitted that he had seen many crimes, but none as brutal as this. Blood, flesh, splatters of brain matter on the walls. The bodies of the married couple who owned the mansion were practically unrecognizable, so mutilated were they. The head of this ideal family, Jose Menendez, suffered the most. The influential entertainment company executive was found in the living room. He had been shot in the face with a shotgun at close range. In total, he received 6 gunshot wounds. His wife, housewife Kitty Menendez, a former beauty queen, lay mortally wounded near the sofa. Kitty received 10 gunshot wounds. Before the bullet hit her cheek, it appeared the woman had tried to crawl across the floor. Both Jose and Kitty had several horrific wounds inflicted after death. Due to its brutality, the crime initially seemed like the work of the mafia, but at the same time, the mutilations could have been made to create the appearance of a gangster attack or a contract killing. What really happened in this wealthy mansion still needed to be figured out. Police, forensics experts, and homicide detectives gradually filled the house. Everyone had the same questions on their minds. Who could have done this? Who would dare commit a crime in such a prestigious neighborhood? Was it a robbery, or did the attack have more personal motives? Even to investigators, the Menendez family seemed untouchable at first glance, living in a privileged position. And such violence never happened to people like them. When a sergeant from the Beverly Hills Police Department spoke with the brothers that evening, they already had an alibi ready. After the movies, they went to a festival in India, returned home shortly before midnight, and stumbled upon their parents' bodies in the living room. The detective found the brothers' statements and their emotional state so plausible that he didn't ask them to take a gunpowder residue test. But as the night dragged on, and the following days, investigators looked more closely at the details. And the focus of their suspicions shifted from an act of random violence, a gang attack as the Sun suggested, to the idea that all these atrocities were committed by someone close to the Menendez family. The crime in the prestigious Beverly Hills neighborhood made headlines in all media, and all eyes were on Lyle and Eric, who had suddenly lost both parents. They were just 2 young men who had abruptly become orphans. Eric and Lyle spoke with reporters, friends, family, and relatives, sharing their grief, shock, and dismay. And everyone sympathized with them and expressed their love and support. One memorial service for friends and company employees was held in Los Angeles. A second memorial service was organized in Princeton for family and close friends. Eric and Lyle arrived in their best suits and looked utterly crushed by grief. When one of the sons, Lyle, delivered a eulogy in a broken voice, fondly recalling his parents, everyone could see how he was suffering. Eric was too upset to speak at the ceremony in front of everyone. But in any case, all those present shared this tragedy with the guys. People who lose a loved one behave differently. Some withdraw into themselves and refuse communication. Others, on the contrary, seek to have friends and loved ones around them all the time. Everyone grieves in their own way. However, for Lyle and Eric, grief looked different from that of most people who had buried their mother and father. After the tragic death of their parents, the brothers seemed to celebrate the event by going on a shopping spree. These were not small purchases. These were big spendings that sparked a lot of talk. Apparently, the guys figured that the best way for the sole heirs of a $14 million estate to cope with the death of their father and mother was to start managing the finances at their own discretion. A few days after the funerals and over the following months, the young men simply spent the $1 million insurance payout. Lyle bought a fancy Porsche for $64,000, and Eric bought himself a new Jeep Wrangler. The brothers often went out, bought frequent Rolex watches, designer clothes, expensive jewelry. They flew first class on luxurious trips. They went to Las Vegas, played high-stakes gambling. In general, they lived it up to the fullest. But it didn't stop there. The brothers invested their wealth in various business projects. For example, Lyle spent $550,000 to buy a restaurant in Princeton, which he named Mr. Buffalo. And Eric tried to invest $40,000 in a concert promotion company, which ultimately turned out to be a scam. None of it mattered, because the children of wealthy parents were finally doing what they had long dreamed of. And now no one was stopping them. The brothers Menendez's extravagant spending was followed not only by the public and press, but also by detectives. Such behavior seemed extremely suspicious to them. Why did two young men crushed by grief so easily and quickly come to terms with the death of both parents? At the crime scene, investigators found some inconsistencies. At the time of the crime, the Menendez mansion was securely protected. The family had one of the best security systems of the time. Yet the alarm was simply turned off, and there were no signs of forced entry. Although the house was in disarray and it seemed like robbers were searching for valuables, in reality, almost nothing was missing. Inside the mansion, there were plenty of expensive interior items, jewelry, and cash, but it all remained in place. Investigators began to suspect that it was all staged to create the appearance of a burglary. A survey of neighbors showed that the head of the house, Jose, had many enemies. He was disliked at work. People said he was very cruel, constantly arguing with everyone and intolerant of others' mistakes. One family friend suggested that the Menendez couple's death might involve their children. He had no evidence, just a hunch. According to the witness, relations between the sons and their parents were always strained. Then, the police discovered something strange. It turned out that on August 31st, 11 days after the tragedy in the mansion, the brothers called a computer expert to delete a file from their mother's computer. Most likely, it was a new family will, in which it was assumed Lyle and Eric were not mentioned. The computer expert did his job, but realizing that an investigation into the deaths of two people was ongoing, decided to cover himself. He contacted the police and told them about the Menendez brothers' request, thereby strengthening the investigators' suspicions. Eric, the younger brother, struggled with anxiety and stress all this time after his parents' death. On October 31st, 1989, he couldn't take it anymore and turned to his psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oziel. First, they met and took a short walk in Beverly Hills. The guy complained that he was experiencing terrible depression, haunted by thoughts of suicide. Dr. Oziel suggested going to his office to discuss the problem. But before entering the room, Eric leaned against the wall and said bluntly, "We did it. We killed our parents." The psychologist was shocked, but didn't show it. He invited Eric into the office and began asking questions. That's when the young man started sharing some dark secrets from the home. First, Eric told Dr. Oziel about watching a TV series about a billionaires club. Billionaires Club is a crime story from high society life turned into a mini-series that aired in 1987. It told of wealthy young people from Los Angeles who committed a serious crime for financial gain. After watching the film, Eric felt a kind of inspiration. He went to his older brother and shared his conviction that their parents were going to exclude them from the will and that the brothers would no longer be able to claim the inheritance. It went so far that the young men decided to get rid of their strict father, who poisoned their lives with his prohibitions and then killed their mother so she wouldn't turn them in to the police. Further, Eric told the doctor how he and Lyle went to a large sporting goods store in San Diego and, using a stolen ID, bought two 12-gauge shotguns. The brothers came up with an alibi to create the impression that they were at the movies when robbers attacked their home. So, after shooting their father and mother, the young men collected the shotgun shells and went to a nearby canyon to dispose of the weapons. Then, they took their bloodied clothes and shoes and threw them away with the shells in a dumpster at a gas station. The guys weren't worried about fingerprints or shoe prints because it was their home, and the presence of fingerprints wouldn't raise questions from anyone. Dr. Oziel, having listened to Eric, asked him to call his brother and invite him to a session too so they could discuss the situation together. When Lyle rushed to the psychologist, he was furious. The older brother even threatened the doctor with retribution if he told anyone the information he heard from Eric. Dr. Oziel managed to choose his words and continued the sessions. Eric shared increasingly dark details that made it possible to understand why it all happened. The psychologist made detailed notes and recorded the sessions on tape. Meanwhile, investigators were doing everything to get some irrefutable evidence against the brothers because they were really convinced of their involvement in the crime. The case wasn't moving forward until in March 1990, a certain Miss Judilon Smith called the police. Initially, Judilon went to Dr. Oziel for therapy and hypnosis sessions, but then it turned into a romantic affair. The psychologist was married, but like most who cheat, Oziel told his former patient that she was the love of his life and that he would leave his wife for her. Naturally, he was lying. At some point, the secret romance bored Oziel because he had no intention of destroying his family. And the mistress, who knew about the psychologist's sessions with the Menendez brothers, went to the police and told everything she knew. This was exactly what the investigators wanted. On March 8, 1990, the lead detective on the Menendez case, based on a tip from Dr. Oziel's former lover, obtained a warrant to seize his tape recordings. By the way, this same detective had previously handled the Billionaires Club case, the series about which greatly impressed Eric and essentially became the impetus for developing the criminal plan. Dr. Oziel's audio recordings were confiscated. There were 17 audio cassettes and 7 pages of notes. Thanks to this, detectives had the Menendez brothers' confessions to the murder of their mother and father. Now the young men could not deny their involvement. Under normal circumstances, the law would deem the session recordings inadmissible in court, given the confidentiality between therapists and clients. However, the threat of retribution made by Lyle to the doctor stripped them of the doctor-client privilege. That same day, police stopped Lyle's brand-new Jeep on the way to a restaurant. The young man was taken into custody on suspicion of murdering his parents. His brother Eric was in Israel at a tennis tournament at the time. Since Lyle's arrest became world news, Eric hurried home to avoid being detained in another country. And 3 days later, upon returning to Los Angeles, he turned himself in to the police. After the massacre of their mother and father, the brothers roamed free for nearly 7 months. So why did the two sons commit a crime against their closest people? Did they do it just for money? Was it ordinary greed, or was there some other reason? To understand the Menendez brothers' story, let's go back a few years. So, the head of the family and father of Eric and Lyle was Jose Enrique Menendez. He was born in Havana, Cuba, in 1944. Fleeing the upheavals of the Cuban Revolution, the 16-year-old teenager went to the United States. Jose possessed superhuman determination and was full of resolve to succeed. He carved his own path to the top, from dishwasher in Manhattan to executive at a film studio on the West Coast. Jose enrolled at Southern Illinois University, where he met Kitty Anderson. At 19, he married Kitty, who was 2 years older. After the wedding, The newlyweds moved to New York, where Jose worked tirelessly to earn a degree in accounting. At first, people seemed to really like Jose's determination and assertiveness. These qualities helped him stand out from the crowd and quickly climb the career ladder, from accountant to corporate executive. In 1971, Jose began working at the American car rental company Hertz as head of a division, and 2 years later, he was promoted to CFO of the company. In 1979, 35-year-old Jose Menendez became the global general manager of the corporation, and the following year, he was appointed president of the parent company, RCA Records. Jose's job involved signing contracts with famous artists like Duran Duran, U2, Rick James, and even the boy band Menudo. Menendez was known for his aggressive, tough business style. He always believed it was better to inspire fear than to earn love and favor. This strategy helped Jose achieve a lot and amass a fortune. By 1986, the Menendez family had moved to Los Angeles, and in 1988, they bought a luxurious mansion in the upscale Beverly Hills neighborhood. Kitty Menendez, real name Mary Louise Anderson, over time grew accustomed to being in her husband's shadow. When she was younger, she won the Miss Oak Lawn beauty pageant, but as Jose's wife, she had to accept second roles. Kitty was described as a glamorous lady with a somewhat rebellious character. For Jose, Kitty embodied the American dream he always aspired to. Jose himself was then a beloved man, ready to overcome anything for his goals. That's what attracted Kitty. But her family didn't take to her future son-in-law because he was Cuban. However, the lovers didn't care much. They left everything and moved to another city. At first, Kitty worked as a teacher, but after the birth of Lyle in 1968 and Eric in 1970, she put her career aside to become a housewife and devote all her time to raising her sons. In reality, Kitty dreamed of working in television or radio, but Jose insisted she focus on the children. Kitty's childhood was not the best. Her father treated his wife and children very harshly. After getting married, the girl dreamed of becoming independent from her parents. But her husband's character was no picnic either, so Kitty struggled with depression and resentment her whole life. As Jose's career took off, he spent more time at work. Associating with many women led to him having affairs. Jose had several romances that Kitty learned about, and it was a devastating blow to her. The woman couldn't leave her husband because she was completely dependent on him. To somehow numb the emotional pain, she became addicted to alcohol and illicit drugs. Over the years, she developed a strong dependency. At times, Kitty even contemplated suicide, especially when she learned about Jose's 8-year affair with a woman from New York. So publicly, Kitty supported her husband's ambitions, but inside the family, the atmosphere was unhealthy. The woman was completely absorbed in her husband's goals, but at the same time, she was completely isolated and dependent on Jose in everything. For Lyle and Eric, growing up with such parents was very stressful. Jose's drive to succeed in all areas of his life was reflected in his sons as well. The man demanded constant improvement from the boys. He didn't just expect the children to continue his business. Jose put pressure on them. The man wanted to see successful sons by his side and wouldn't hear any objections. The elder Menendez not only enrolled the brothers in an expensive private school, but also paid for their tennis lessons 3 times a week so they could excel in the elite sport, and even brought professional coaches home. Unfortunately, neither Eric nor Lyle seemed to share their father's passionate desire to succeed. For Lyle and Eric, life revolved around tennis competitions. From a young age, both boys were relentlessly drilled. Jose managed their schedules, coaches, diets. He controlled everything down to the smallest details. First, it was an ironclad path to getting a scholarship. Second, a way to prove to everyone that Jose created winners and his sons were the best. Jose Menendez suffered from perfectionism. This was reflected in his family life as well. It exhausted all the household members mentally, so Lyle and Eric sometimes had it hard. However, The pressure from their father went far beyond the tennis court. He controlled every aspect of his sons' lives, dictating what subjects they chose in school, what books to read, and who to associate with. Jose monitored their phone calls and had an obsessive need to know every step they took. Any disappointment or imperfection triggered a rage attack in the man. The father showed the sons that their worth directly depended on their achievements. Outwardly, Eric and Lyle seemed like confident athletes, but inside, both guys struggled. The older brother, Lyle, developed a stutter in childhood, a speech defect exacerbated by stress. People said his stutter was a result of anxiety. He was often seen as a leader, a ringleader. He was bold and ready to challenge teachers, coaches, and especially his father. But behind his displayed determination hid deep insecurity. Eric, the younger brother, was considered more sensitive, vulnerable, and quiet. In childhood, he also stuttered badly, was shy, withdrawn, especially when his father was around. Eric respected his older brother and always relied on him for protection. The younger one couldn't stand up for himself and was seen as the more vulnerable of the two. When the boys went to school, they mostly stood out for their successes. Once, Jose and Kitty were called from the school and told that their sons were doing poorly in studies. The children had problems with concentration and retaining information. Lyle was labeled a rule breaker. He was cheeky and capricious, and quiet Eric had a harder time studying in school, which made him a target of his father's criticism and anger. When parents were informed about the kids' behavior problems and poor academics, Jose didn't talk to his sons. Instead, he went to the school and started yelling at the teachers and principal, blaming them for the boys' poor performance. Constant control and aggression led to the young men starting to break the law. In 1988, Lyle and Eric committed several burglaries in their neighborhood, stealing over $100,000 in cash and jewelry for the thrill. After that, Jose moved the family to another place to avoid gossip. Father's disappointment reached such a level that he practically wrote his children out of the will. Lyle was studying at Princeton University, where he was put on probation for poor grades and then expelled altogether. For a while, he lived in a dorm. Not wanting to share a room with anyone, the guy simply threw his roommates' things into the hallway. Other students complained that Lyle left the water running in the sinks, leading to a flood. And then, in violation of dorm rules, he repainted the room to his own taste. But all this was just childish mischief from the brothers compared to what they did to get rid of their parents. So, after the double tragedy at the Menendez residence, the public first saw two grieving sons crushed by sorrow, then two extravagant, spendthrift, greedy, selfish young men. But the public didn't yet know what had really been going on behind the walls of this mansion for many years. And finally, the truth came out from Eric Menendez himself. When investigators listened to the audio recordings of Eric's sessions with the psychologist, they learned many new and even more wild things that had happened in this family. During conversations with Dr. Osiel, the young man shared many details about his upbringing. Jose and Kitty were actually terrible parents. They weren't just strict, but sick and cruel people. And over the years, the situation in the house only worsened, and Jose's unbridled character turned discipline into outright violence. Jose Menendez was described as a man who established a reign of terror in the home, where physical intimidation served as a tool to impose his absolute will. Later, the brothers testified that their father beat them not only with his fists, but with any objects that came to hand. He forced them to play tennis even if the teenagers were seriously injured, and brutally punished them if they violated discipline at school or practice in any way. If the sons didn't meet Jose's incredibly high standards, they faced criticism, bullying, and humiliation. The father often openly compared the brothers, making them hate each other. Mother Kitty, Eric, and Lyle also accused of physical abuse. Of course, she wasn't as evil as the father, but she too often slapped the sons or hit them with her fists if they angered her. In reality, Kitty was overwhelmed by her own problems, so at some point she stepped aside and allowed Jose to dominate the house. She didn't care about anything. Naturally, her behavior was influenced by alcohol and illicit drugs. But the most devastating and controversial admission from the brothers were accusations of intimate abuse to which Jose Menendez subjected them. Both Lyle and Eric testified under oath that their father abused them for many years, starting from when Eric was 7 years old and up to the crime in the mansion. The guys described numerous instances of molestation, coercion, and psychological manipulation that left deep trauma in their souls. And this became their dark secret that pushed them to the limit and led to the crime. During the trial, other witnesses also testified about what they knew. So the boys' cousin Diane testified that when they were about 8 years old, Lyle mentioned in conversation that his father had touched his private parts. When Diane told Kitty about it, she just brushed it off, saying it was nonsense. The mother simply didn't believe the girl and forbade talking about such topics. The boy's cousin Alan testified that Jose Menendez took showers with his sons. To another cousin, Andy, 13-year-old Eric confided in secret that his father massaged his genitals but asked him not to tell anyone. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was a letter Eric sent to his cousin Andy in 1988. The young man wrote that he was afraid of his father because he came to him at nights. Quote from the letter, "Andy, it's still going on, but now it's even worse for me. I can't explain it. He's so fat, I can't stand him. I never know when it's going to happen, and it's driving me crazy. Every night I sleep thinking he might come again. I don't know if I can take it." By the way, this letter is considered incredibly important evidence that the brothers didn't invent the acts of violence in the home just to justify their actions. Unfortunately, this key evidence was not included in the initial trial, and in recent years has become a sort of central argument for lawyers seeking new hearings. Where was their mother all this time while Jose was corrupting his sons? Apparently, Kitty didn't want to interfere at all. In fact, the woman not only knew about the ongoing violence but sometimes was present during it or stayed in the next room to make sure no one entered. Kitty condoned her husband's abnormal behavior and sought to keep it all secret to not ruin the family's public image. The mother's attitude toward her sons only exacerbated their emotional trauma. Lyle and Eric felt betrayed by both parents. From birth, they fell into a trap from which there was no escape. Interestingly, the brothers were so afraid of their father that they didn't even share their experiences with each other. Eric first told Lyle about the molestations 3 weeks before the massacre, and Lyle in turn confessed to his brother that Jose started abusing him for 6 years, but stopped without explanation when he turned 8. The brothers decided to finally voice their claims to their father, and in the end, Jose threatened to kill them if they told anyone. And Kitty said Eric made it all up, which, according to the brothers, became the motive for the crime. In 1988, a year before Jose and Kitty's death, Eric Menendez and his friends wrote a script called Friends, in which the main character, a wealthy teenager, got rid of his parents to inherit their fortune. Although the script itself was mediocre, it became an important element of the investigation because the events in the script closely resembled the real crime whose victims were the author's parents. When all this information surfaced, the public's perception of the Menendez family turned upside down. At first, everyone pitied Jose and Kitty, victims of their own sons, but when Lyle and Eric's testimonies were voiced in court, people began to sympathize with them because it wasn't about greed, but about decades of constant fear. All this caused shock in the judicial system and society. The 1993 trial of the Menendez brothers became a television spectacle. When the broadcast began, viewers in the United States eagerly awaited this historic moment. Due to the tragic details of the case, the public had heightened interest in this story. Viewers couldn't tear themselves away from the screens. At first, the media was full of headlines about millionaire youths and son killers. People were curious to see two spoiled rich guys who shot their parents for money. But then, When the first trial began, and the defense presented a version of decades of physical, emotional, and intimate abuse by Jose and Kitty, opinions shifted sharply. According to California law, the brothers could be found guilty of manslaughter only if they proved they faced imminent danger. Lyle and Eric's lawyers insisted that the brothers were not just criminals craving profit, but, on the contrary, intimidated victims pushed to the brink. The defense team relied on a then-novel legal concept, the battered child syndrome or child abuse syndrome. This is a psychological and medical term used to describe the physical and emotional symptoms experienced by children subjected to prolonged abuse, often from parents or guardians. Over time, they may develop a deep sense of helplessness and distorted perception of reality. Such people live in constant fear and believe escape is impossible, leading in turn to extreme measures. The defense team for Eric and Lyle argued that the brothers suffered from this syndrome and genuinely believed their father threatened their lives. That is, the defendants openly, albeit unreasonably, believed they faced imminent danger and acted to protect themselves. According to Lyle and Eric, every day they lived held a threat. Every moment in Jose's presence felt like a ticking time bomb to them. The defense argued that the brothers had no other choice, and it wasn't about getting parental money, but rather survival. Jose had good connections. He was very influential, and the brothers were terrified of what would happen if they tried to seek help. The prosecution, however, argued that Eric and Lyle killed their parents out of greed to inherit their wealth. And the cohesive story of domestic abuse was fabricated specifically to avoid punishment. Although no past abuse can justify such a cold-blooded act by sons toward their father and mother. The prosecution called Lyle's ex-girlfriend, who testified that Lyle offered her a large sum of money to claim that Jose Menendez had made advances on her. And before that, the guy told tall tales about how the mafia shot his parents. So if viewed from another angle, the brothers' stories didn't seem 100% truthful. However, when Eric Menendez testified, many people watching really felt his pain. The guy cried, describing in horrific detail what his father did to him for many years. Due to the amount of detail he went into, it was very hard to believe it was all made up. Lyle was more reserved in court and better controlled his emotions. Some considered the young man more cold-blooded, but most saw in his behavior a sign of deeper emotional suppression. Since the entire process was broadcast live, every sigh, every tear, cough, every movement was scrutinized, and it was just a national obsession. After months of testimonies and heated discussions, the jury reached a deadlock. They couldn't come to a unanimous decision, which meant the trial was annulled. This was seen as a partial victory for the brothers, but on the other hand, it meant they would have to go through it all again in another trial. The second trial differed drastically from the first. It received less coverage, partly because the judge didn't allow video filming in the courtroom and also stated that graphic and detailed descriptions of past abuse weren't directly related to the crime, so he limited testimony on some claims of mistreatment in the Menendez family. The defense portrayed Jose as a cruel, violence-prone father, an unfaithful husband, and accused Kitty of substance abuse and neglecting parental duties. However, ultimately, the defense couldn't present irrefutable evidence on any of these accusations, and the brothers' habit of high-fiving each other after testifying certainly didn't help their credibility. In the end, on March 20th, 1996, Lyle and Eric Menendez were found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. They were to spend the rest of their lives behind bars. By the time of the life sentence, Lyle Menendez was already 28 years old, and Eric Menendez was 25. The brothers' path through the prison system was marked by both difficulties and changes. Initially, they were deliberately separated, and the separation was so hard that Eric went on a hunger strike trying to achieve reunification with Lyle. After spending over 20 years in different prisons, the Menendez brothers reunited in 2018 when Lyle was transferred to the facility where Eric was serving his sentence. In prison, both brothers embarked on a path of personal development and, in a sense, redemption. Lyle earned a bachelor's degree in sociology and is now pursuing a master's. He worked for 15 years on the prison council, where inmates are allowed to participate in decisions about their daily lives, the institution's operations, and representing peers' interests. Lyle Menendez actively participated in improving prison conditions, advocated for inmates' rights, helped implement rehabilitation, education, and community development programs behind bars. Eric, in prison, became interested in religious studies. He led Bible study classes and even became a minister. Eric worked with terminally ill inmates, providing them comfort and care at the end of life. He also became an advocate for teenagers who survived abuse. He mentored other inmates with similar trauma and contributed to educational work behind bars. Both brothers got married. Lyle Menendez's first marriage was to Anna Erickson, a former model and beauty salon administrator. The couple later divorced because the wife suspected her husband of infidelity. With his second wife, Rebecca Sneed, Lyle met through correspondence and communicated with her for about 10 years. In 2024, the couple separated. Eric also met the love of his life, Tani Ruda Sakamoto, through correspondence. Their regular letter communication led to them meeting in person. During one of the woman's visits to the prison, Eric got down on one knee in front of her and proposed. They got married and even co-wrote and edited a book about their marriage. Despite the ban on conjugal visits, the couple is still together. Both brothers are often called model inmates. Lyle said his own childhood surprisingly prepared him well for the chaos of prison life. For many years, Eric and Lyle tried to file appeals, but they were constantly denied. Most likely, their fate was sealed. In recent years, interest in the Menendez case has sharply increased. There are many reasons for the renewed popularity. The trials attracted international media attention and inspired numerous documentaries, dramatizations, books, and parodies. Here's just a small part of them. In 2017, Eric and Lyle became subjects of the documentary Truth and Lies: The Menendez Brothers, American Sons, American Killers. In the same year, a new series, How It Really Happened, with Hill Harper aired, with an episode dedicated to the Menendez brothers' story. In 2020, the brothers were featured in a special episode of How They Caught. In 2021, Lyle and Eric became subjects of a special release called Inside the Menendez Movement, which covered the brothers' popularity on the social network TikTok and the growing number of supporters among youth, both in the US and abroad. Then there was the Netflix dramatic series Monsters: The Lyle and Eric Menendez Story. And in 2024, the documentary The Menendez Brothers, with prison interviews of the brothers, was released. All this attracted a new generation of viewers to the case, many of whom didn't even know the full scale of the abuse allegations. After decades, new accusations emerged from Roy Rosselló, a former member of the popular boy band Menudo. Roy testified in 2023 that as a young boy, he was repeatedly molested by Jose Menendez. At the time, Jose was organizing tours for the popular boy band. Once, Roy was brought to the Menendez mansion, where Jose plied him with wine laced with illicit substances. There were other incidents after that. Roy's accusations came much later than the trial of Eric and Lyle, but they represented third-party testimony of Jose's predatory behavior and only added weight and credibility to the brothers' statements. Around the same time, a letter surfaced that Eric wrote to his cousin in 1988, months before the attack on his parents, describing his father's molestations. The letter was found by chance in the cousin's old things. Thus, interest in the forgotten case grew. All public discussions and online debates coincided with new legal efforts by the brothers' defense. Eric and Lyle's lawyers argue that if these pieces of evidence were presented to the jury today, they would most likely lead to a different outcome, possibly to conviction for manslaughter. In October 2024, the Los Angeles County Prosecutor's Office began reviewing the case, acknowledging the complexity of the circumstances surrounding the brothers' abuse. The district attorney recommended resentencing or even holding a new trial, but then everything changed. A new district attorney appeared in Los Angeles, who rejected all previous recommendations and opposed a new trial. But very recently, on May 13, 2025, a Los Angeles Superior Court judge finally issued a new sentence for Lyle and Eric Menendez. Their prison term was reduced to 50 years to life. That is, after serving 50 years, the brothers will be eligible for parole. At the time of the crime, neither was 26 yet, and the new sentence gave them the right to release on youth offender parole in accordance with California's laws on juvenile offenders. At the heart of the Menendez brothers' crime lie two contradictory narratives. On one hand, the prosecution portrayed Lyle and Eric as two cold-blooded, calculating criminals who shot their own parents for a multi-million-dollar inheritance and then staged a public display of fake grief. On the other hand, the defense presents testimonies of two deeply traumatized young men who endured years of brutal physical, emotional, and intimate abuse from their closest people. To this day, many wonder whether Lyle and Eric Menendez are guilty, or whether they became victims of horrific abuse, driven to a breaking point and deserving a different outcome. What do you think about this? If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.